This story is a hard one to explain. To this day, my brother Ben and I still question what exactly went down. Before I begin, I must give a bit of background. Ben, 21M, and I, 25F, moved in with our mother and grandfather 2 years ago. After the passing of our stepfather, we thought she could use some help in taking care of our grandfather who struggles mentally. With my education in psychology and the brute strength of Ben, we figured we could be useful when it came to my grandfather's treatment and general house upkeep. The house we lived in was in the backwoods of North Louisiana. My mother, stepfather, and grandfather moved into the house a few months before my stepfather's passing. And as I said, we moved in with them shortly after, along with the 4 of us. We had 2 dogs. One was a small Maltese named August, and one larger-built miniature Schnauzer named Henry. August was my mother's dog. He has been in my life since at least middle school. We joke that he acts like an old man, and sometimes even favors an old man. Henry was my grandfather's dog. At the time of this story, he was only 3 years old, relatively young, and still had that puppy dog playfulness about him. The 2 got along like brothers. You could tell they loved each other, but Henry loved to mess with old August. We hadn't ever lived outside of a gated community where each house looked the same and had an acre of fenced land in the back. When my mother was a child, she practically lived in the woods with her mom and dad. And now that her dad is slowly losing his mind, she felt that a place of familiarity would help his deterioration. With our new house being located, quite literally, in the middle of the woods, and the passing of our stepfather, we knew that she needed help. At the time, our grandfather's decreasing mental health was revealed in moments of accidents, misplacing items that he swears are in one place when they have obviously been in another. Looking for a fork in the bathroom or looking for towels in the garage, and getting appointments confused. The moment we knew that stronger surveillance was needed was when he began leaving doors open. Each door left open was shortly noticed, so there wasn't an immediate problem. However, the risks that could come with leaving the door wide open was something that we didn't want to entertain. My house duty was taking care of the animals and the night shift for my grandfather. This included ensuring that medicines were received, as well as being aware of the goings-on in the house during the night. This was usually no problem. My mother would watch him while I was at work, and then after I had a nap, I would assume position and keep watch over the late hours of the night. Given that we were far from the nearest city, we also kept alarm systems on the main entrance and the door leading to the back patio. This was for general security. However, it also helped in managing the whereabouts of my grandfather. This alarm system was the type that kept a log of which door was opened and closed at any given time. This function didn't seem like the type of thing that is used on a day-to-day basis. Our routine was simple. My mother would take care of my grandfather while me and Ben were at work. Once we returned, me and Mother would nap while Ben took watch and completed his share of the household chores. After a short rest, Mother and Ben would head to bed, while I assumed the role and began my share of the chores. This worked for a while, and everyone played their part. However, my grandfather's illness seemed to worsen. I also began to notice a lack in my performance with the work I got paid to do and the work I completed at the house. This specific night, I was very exhausted. Work was bad, and life was hitting harder than it had been before. While my usual bedtime was about 4 a.m., giving me 2 hours of sleep without monitoring, I fell asleep way before that. I am not sure when exactly I fell asleep. However, I know exactly when I woke up. I heard a crash and was jolted awake by the smell of dirt and a warm breeze. My eyes fell upon a knocked-over trash can and an illuminated doorway. I grabbed my phone and the time read 3 a.m. I rushed into my grandfather's room to see him fast asleep. I then assessed the doorway. The door was lit by the outdoor floodlights. These lights are only triggered by movement and, more importantly, only stay lit for no more than 5 minutes after being triggered. I looked around the immediate piece of the doorway. There were no strange noises and nothing out of place. The only thing weird was the fact the door was open at all. I shut the door, double-checked the lock, and returned to the couch where I had just woken. My heart was racing incredibly fast. To this day, I can remember the sound of my heartbeat echoing through the halls of my house. What could have happened if he was hurt? He was the one to open the door. My mind raced through hypotheticals. As I increased my anxiety about what could have happened while I was asleep, I remembered that the security app tracks when the door is open, closed. Immediately, I pulled out my phone and searched through the log. The logs show in order of most recent to least recent. 6:17, 2:45 a.m. Back, unlocked, open. The door had been open for 15 minutes. I slowly calmed myself down, seeing as how everyone was safe now, and 15 minutes wasn't as bad as the hour I thought it had been. It was now 3:30 a.m., and it was now time for me to get some sleep. I calmed myself and proceeded to get some sleep. While I was getting ready for work that morning, I heard my mother aggressively searching for Henry. She was calling his name across every inch of the house, inside and out. I remember asking what was wrong, and that is when I was informed that Henry was missing. It hit me at that moment that if he had left Mother's room during the night, he could have escaped. I didn't say anything. I felt that it wasn't relevant information, at least not yet. The dogs had never escaped Mother's room during the night before. We searched for Henry everywhere, in the bushes, at the shed, in the front yard, and nothing. When I realized that the chances of finding him were decreasing, I spoke up about the door being opened. The guilt of falling asleep kept me from explaining it like that, and instead, I created a vague story that didn't put me as a good or bad guy. Now that everyone agreed on what happened, we searched all around the woods. Nothing. We couldn't find any piece of him. I needed to go to work, so I left the search and agreed to continue once I returned. I think I had about 2 hours left in my shift when I received the relieving phone call that Henry was found. When my mother was explaining how they found him, she sounded perplexed. She explained that he just showed up and that he seemed to be kind of happy. I finished my shift and rushed home. When I exited my car, the sounds of chaos seeped through the walls. When I entered the house, I was met with an angry August and a calm Henry. My mother attempted to separate the two while Ben worked on calming our grandfather. I remember her begging for my help. I rushed over and grabbed August and rushed him to my mother's bedroom. I then helped Ben comfort our grandfather. Mother was attempting to calm herself down at the same time. Henry just sat there. I know, he's a dog. He isn't going to express stress the way a human does. But he didn't express anything at all. He just sat there. At the time, I ignored it. My focus was mostly on the psycho dog who kept barking. Over time, August finally calmed down. We kept the two separate for the rest of the day. Henry had been outside for hours, and we assumed that he had interacted with animals, which caused August to become hostile. There are 2 bedrooms upstairs and 2 downstairs. The 2 upstairs are where Ben and my mother stay. I share the downstairs with my grandfather. The dogs usually slept with my mother, but since the fiasco with August, Henry slept with Ben. The next day, I was sure to stay awake. I had energy drinks and gum to help. Everyone went to bed around 10 p.m. It was just me and my grandfather watching some TV, until about 11 p.m. when I sent him to bed. Finally, it was time to watch TV, snack, and attempt to stay awake. It had only been a couple of hours after sending my grandfather to bed when I heard a crunching noise outside. The noise was faint, so I continued watching TV. A few minutes later, I heard another substantial crunching noise along with a yelp. I knew it wasn't a huge deal, but I decided to investigate anyway. I headed towards the back door to see if I noticed anything in the floodlights which were on. As I peeked out the window, there was blood a few feet from the door. I tossed it up to being from an animal injury that I had no business in doctoring. As I closed the blinds, I noticed movement. When I glanced to see what it was, my blood ran cold. It was Henry just sitting there. I knew for a fact he went to bed with Ben. However, there was a chance that Ben could have opened his door and allowed Henry to explore. But how did he get outside? I knew for sure my grandfather hadn't opened it, and my mother and Ben would have spoken to me if they had come downstairs for any reason. I pulled my phone out to check the security system. However, when the app opened, the only alert was from earlier that day, not within the last hour. I just stood there. It felt like he was staring at me as if expecting me to just walk away. I then began to question why there was blood, and not that there was blood, but why there was so much of it. It was as if a large dog had been drained of blood. As my mind began examining the list of possible logical reasons, I then noticed that Henry didn't have a single drop on him. He was just a puppy, and even though I was very confused about how the situation came to be, I felt pity, opened the door, and called him back inside. He slowly stood and made his way inside. His blank stare bore holes in me. I brushed the weirdness off as me freaking myself out. Plus I was exhausted. I led the dog back upstairs to Ben's room. The door was wide open. It doesn't explain how he got inside, but it does explain how he got out of Ben's room. I pushed the events to the back of my mind and helped the pup into bed. He curled up and went right to sleep. I went back down the stairs and did the same, going straight to bed. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, Ben rushed into my room. "Hey, did you hear anything strange last night?" he asked, poking his head in. His breathing was heavy, almost panicked. "Well, I did hear something, but I assumed it was just animals being animals." He laughed sarcastically. "You should come see what this animal did." My eyes grew wide as I followed him down the stairs and out the back door. As we turned the corner, I gasped loudly. My blood ran cold. Laying on the ground next to the house was a deer. However, this deer was brutally mutilated. A half-emptied carcass lay with blood leading from one side of the house, almost as if the body had been dragged. "Ben, what the hell is this?" I asked. He laughed nervously. "Why are you asking me? You were the one up all night. Did you hear or see anything?" I crossed my arms and held my breath. I shook my head slowly, staring at the strange sight. He shrugged. "Honestly, I have noticed more coyote activity in the woods while I hunt. It is rare. It isn't hard to assume a hungry coyote saw some yummy deer I had and decided to have takeout." "You're weird," I said as I returned inside, grabbed my keys, and headed to work. My mind raced. I saw Henry sitting calmly amongst the blood, knowing now that the blood had come from a torn-up deer carcass. Why hadn't he chased the coyote? Why didn't the coyote take out the small dog? I tried to push down all the illogical thoughts, and instead attempted to push the whole situation deep into my mind and focus on the real issue. A coyote. When I got home from work, it was the same routine. This night was pretty normal, given the past couple of days. My mother and I discussed the plans for a vacation to the city. Vacation is a stretch. We had planned to explore a living situation that was better suited for our grandfather, that allowed my mother to frequently care for him and for me and Ben to visit when needed. We were leaving in the morning to head to the city, so before bed, we cleared up some details. My night patrol was normal. My grandfather got up a few times. However, I stopped him. I frequently checked the back door for coyote activity, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I decided that it was safe to go to sleep. As I was falling asleep, there was a rustling sound in the living room. I slowly climbed out of bed and reached the door to listen to the noises from the living room. The noise became clearer. It sounded like something was trying to open a door, but as if their hands were unable to grip the handle. I decided to look at what was struggling. The door creaked slightly as I opened it wide enough to stick my head out. I couldn't see the back door from my bedroom, so I decided to check that direction first. When the back door came into view, Henry Saturday facing the door, I scoffed at my high anxiety. I turned around and started to go to bed when it started again, the sound of a poor attempt to open a door. The sound came from the direction I had left, causing me to decide that to this day, I think I'm glad I made it. I decided not to investigate the continuing noise. I returned to my room, turned on a YouTube video on my phone, and forced my eyes shut. I hoped the distracting noise would block the thoughts that flooded my mind. I woke up the next morning with a massive headache. As I exited my room, I greeted Ben with a good morning. He nodded as he continued loading up my and my mother's cars with luggage. Due to scheduling, we were driving separately. My mother was giving my grandfather his medications. I greeted her and my grandfather along with August, who stayed especially close to my mother. Henry was assumed to be inside since Ben mentioned seeing him before packing began. It was about time for us to leave when Ben and Mother ran through a checklist to ensure all of my grandfather's necessities were packed. My grandfather was waiting in the passenger seat of my mother's car. My mother and Ben were assessing the checklist, while I watched over the dogs. After the incident, there was a mutual agreement to either ensure the dogs were separate, or that if they were together, They must be monitored. Of course. This was my job. I studied my phone and sat at the dining table. I heard a door open and assumed it was Ben about to call for me. When I looked up, the front door was closed and the back door was open. I panicked. August bolted towards the woods. Henry was nowhere to be found. I ran to Ben and Mother and explained that somehow the dogs escaped and we needed to find them. We explained to our mother that we would meet up once we found them. She reluctantly agreed to leave us, and we rushed into the woods. We searched for what felt like hours, but in reality was probably 30 minutes. Ben yelled. "Find anything?" I yelled back, defeated. "Nothing." Shortly after that interaction, I hear Ben yell, "I found August." Thank God. I giggled, due to a mix of stress and relief. Now to find Henry. I continued searching until I came across a familiar scene, a half-emptied carcass. Then time of a relatively small animal, a dog. From where I was, I couldn't tell any details. The closer I got, the more panicked I became. It was Henry. Blood pooled outside his corpse. I let out a brief yelp. "You okay?" Ben yelled. He sounded closer to the house. "It's Henry. He's dead." I create a shallow grave with leaves and bury the dog. He was just a pup. It was hard to say goodbye, but I needed to meet up with Ben. We met at the wood line and Ben could tell I was very upset. He rubbed my back as we slowly made our way to the house. I held August, I guess to help me cope with the scene I had witnessed. We got about 100 feet from the house when I noticed Ben stopped walking. I removed my gaze from the ground and brought it up to him. His face was pale, and his gaze fell onto the house. I turned to see what he saw, and I could feel my legs begin to shake. It was Henry, just sitting there. I grabbed Ben's arm and dragged him to the car. I got into the driver's seat, and once Ben was safely inside the vehicle, I threw it in reverse and left as fast as I could. Until that point, I never shared the strange happenings that I had experienced. I guess I figured that it was the exhaustion, so I didn't think it was necessary to share. I remember the car ride to meet with our mother was full of heavy silence that I finally broke. "What do we tell her?" I asked. "That an animal got him," Ben responded. I don't... No, I'm not ready to talk about it. Ben interrupted me. When we met with our mother, we told her the sorry news. While on vacation, we decided it was best to quickly find a place there and move out of the home. We left it abandoned. We told our mother that her focus should be on our grandfather. While Ben and I worked on the house, we never returned to that house. Ben still won't talk to me about what happened. I will never tell my mother. My grandfather recently passed, and after my stepfather's passing, I knew that she wouldn't be able to handle the terrifying news that Henry may not have been Henry. I decided to share this as a way to hopefully cope with these experiences that I ultimately had to suffer through alone. Thank you for reading. Have you ever had a job that you simultaneously cared about and also didn't really care about? Like, you would make an effort while there, but when outside of work, you loathed to even think about it. Maybe you'd put in the minimum effort, but you'd still be devastated if you ever lost this job. On a rare occasion, you'd go above and beyond, but you'd never consider yourself worthy of Employee of the Month. That's me working at the Gentleman's Pizza Parlor. As the name suggests, we sell pizza. I'm the delivery driver, and I have been for over a year now. I work evenings. I get shifts every day, but they're short shifts. My boss is never that mad if I want to take the day off, because he has a system where he'll make one of the busboys take his car to make the deliveries anyway. We don't really get that many orders anyway. Sure, it's a small town, and there's only 1 or 2 pizza places around, but Guigino's is way cheaper. You can't sacrifice quality, my boss always says while cursing Guigino's. That's how we got our name. My boss likes to think that his pizza is top of the range, a fine dining experience, a gentleman's pizza. In my opinion, we're just okay. Maybe we're a bit too sparse on the cheese. Still, one of those times where I considered that I was going above and beyond in my job was when I bought that briefcase. I was loitering around town, window shopping, when I happened upon a briefcase in the window of an antique store. What really struck me about it was how big it was. big enough to fit, say, a couple of 14-inch pizza boxes inside comfortably. When I showed up to work the next day, I had the briefcase. It made my boss laugh so much that for a moment, I really did feel an immense amount of pride in my work. Delivering a pizza in a briefcase sure lived up to our name, and my boss instantly okayed the idea. The briefcase itself, apart from its size, was nothing much to look at. It was battered at the corners and made of brown leather. On the top of it, there were 3 dials which I initially thought were combination locks, but no dice. The case didn't lock. They were pretty much useless, and I just assumed that the locking mechanism on the case was broken. There was also a small metal plaque just to the right of the handle that said one of a double set, meaning that there was another matching briefcase out there somewhere in the world. I never even once considered that this thing was rare or worth a lot of money. To me, it was just a fun, gimmicky way to do my job. For whatever reason, business really picked up that summer. I was driving to the address of a delivery, the briefcase on the passenger seat of my car next to me. When I pulled up to the house, I picked up the briefcase and noticed that it was suspiciously light. When I opened the case, the pizza was gone. I had been sure that I'd put it in there, but also I wouldn't have put it past myself to drive off without the order. So I sped back to the shop where I got an earful from my boss, who claims he gave the pizza to me, and, eventually, the fresh order. This was just a taste of things to come. You see, this started to happen more and more frequently. My boss even made me take a piss test, convinced that I was high. He also accused me of stealing. You see, there were occasions where he stood by me as I loaded 2 pizza boxes into the briefcase, and when I pulled up to the delivery address with only 1 pizza in the case, I had to turn around and go back. He was this close to firing me, and I wouldn't have blamed him. All I knew was that the pizzas were disappearing, and I had no clue where they were going. I didn't pay much attention at the time, but now when I look back at fall, all I can think about is the amount of missing cat posters that were on our notice board at work. You see, around this time, although I had assumed that the locking mechanism on the case was broken, it shut on me and wouldn't open. I even tried to pry this thing apart with a crowbar, but it wouldn't budge. This would happen for a couple of hours at a time, and then, like magic, the thing would be openable again as if nothing had happened. The case was really starting to smell at this point too. Not old pizza smell, but like something rotten. I tried to leave it open as much as possible to air the stink, but nothing seemed to make it go away. That's that job apathy I was talking about earlier. No matter how bad the briefcase started to smell, I never replaced it. One night, I was airing out the briefcase. I had left it open on the kitchen table in my apartment, but when I woke up the next morning, it was closed. Another magically stuck shut moment. I picked it up and rattled it hard, but it felt full. Something inside moved around, and a pitiful yowl came from within the case. I dropped it in shock, and as I did, the thing sprung open. It was empty, but it smelled worse than ever. That apathy again. I shrugged it off. I should point out that at the time, I was heavily stoned. Even my boss's piss tests hadn't deterred me from sparking up semi-regularly. That same week, an order came in. I placed the pizza, a 12-inch meat lovers, into the briefcase and drove away. This address was pretty far away, just on the outskirts of town. I don't remember much about the house itself, only that it was fairly nondescript. When I knocked on the door, a man answered almost immediately, as if he had been standing behind the door just waiting. He was in his early 30s, with long, greasy brown hair tied into a low ponytail. He had bad acne, bad teeth, bad everything. His face was wet with a sheen of sweat, and the inside of his house reeked. He grinned at me and looked down at the pizza. "Wow," he said. "It really is identical to mine." "That's $18, I said to him promptly, not really wanting to engage in conversation with a guy that looked like that. "Your briefcase," he said. He had a funny manner of speaking, all high-pitched and breathy. I'm normally quite slow on the uptake, but this clicked instantly, and, wanting to hurry the interaction along and get out of there, I unenthusiastically said, "Oh, you have the other one in the matching set. That's cool." The man made no effort to reach for money or anything. He simply languished in the doorframe, and I stood in front of him awkwardly. I thought I should finally order pizza from you guys officially. You know, after all the freebies you've been giving me. This stumped me, so I just stood there and said nothing. The briefcase, he prompted. Do you really not know how it works? I could feel the pizza turning cold in the box in my hands. What do you mean? I asked slowly. He turned on his heels and headed back into the house, leaving the door wide open. When he didn't return after a few minutes, I followed him into the house. Calling, sir. Sir, you still have to pay for this pizza. The house smelled rotten. The guy was sitting in what would have been a lounge if it weren't for all the clutter. Amongst the mess, there were several moldy-looking pizza boxes. Our own brand, even though I knew I had never delivered there before. He had his own briefcase, truly identical to mine, on his lap, and he gestured for me to sit on the floor across from him. Sir, I need to get back to work. Are you going to pay for this pizza? The whole interaction was wigging me out, and I really wanted to escape the smell of this house. This won't take a moment. There's a big tip in it for you, the guy responded. So, Saturday. He instructed me to close my briefcase with the pizza box inside, so I did. Then, he flipped one of the dials on top of his case, the ones which I had assumed were broken locking mechanisms, and opened his case. There was a pizza box inside. He took it out and opened it. The smell of Meat Lover's pizza added to the already sweaty smell in the room and made me want to barf. Open yours, he instructed, and I did. My pizza was gone. That's right, the guy said, all girlish and excited. Isn't it amazing? Here, watch this. He took some money from his pocket, a $20 bill, fiddled with one of the dials on top of his briefcase, put the money inside, and then shut it. He instructed me which of the 3 dials I should flip, and when I opened my own briefcase, the greasy $20 bill was inside. Dude, you nearly got me fired, was all I could think to say. He giggled. That's not all, he responded, and made a clicking noise in the back of his throat. A curious mewing emanated from somewhere at the back of the lounge, behind all the trash and clutter, and a small black and white kitten approached at the sound of the clicks. The guy picked up the kitten in one hand, and with the other, he beckoned for me to close my briefcase, which I did. He toggled a different dial on the case, and then, with a smooth and rehearsed motion, he used both hands to wring the kitten's neck. I yelped and shot up, but he had already quickly stuffed the kitten's body into the case and slammed it shut. Relax, he told me, flashing a grin with all of his bad teeth. I was paralyzed, and stood rooted to the spot before quickly grabbing at my own case, hoping to free the kitten and check if it was all right. However, my case was stuck fast, and the lid wouldn't open. I call that one the privacy lock, the guy said, sounding bored. You can't get in, he continued in a sing-song voice. I was about to yell, shaking all over, when he held up one finger to silence me. This last lock, he said, I call it Void All. He flipped the 3rd and final dial on his case, and when he opened it up, the kitten was gone. I grabbed at my own case, now able to open it. But the kitten wasn't in there either. I turned on my heel to leave, and as I was halfway out the door, the last thing I heard him say was, the only thing is, I could never figure out where it sends them to. I tried to put this whole encounter out of my mind. In the following days, I only delivered pizza with what he had called the privacy lock engaged, and I never had any more trouble with the boxes vanishing. It was only after a week, sometime in the middle of the night, that I realized I had been transporting food in the same case that had been used to store cats, both dead and dying. I had thrown up at the thought and put the briefcase in the back of my closet. I ordered a new one for work the next day. I know, I'm a saint. It was weeks after this that I heard a rumble coming from inside my closet. The case inside was shifting around, and a muffled scratching was coming from within. I tried, but couldn't prise it open. I was of the thinking that this had to end, so I grabbed my phone and a hammer, the only intimidating thing that I could think of at the time, and drove over to my timeshare partner's house. When I knocked on the door, he answered immediately. his face fixed in a nervous grin that looked almost pained. He was pale and sweaty. "It's not me this time," was all he said. I went inside his house again, with half a mind to cuss him out and start breaking things with my hammer. Threatened to call the cops if he ever hurt another animal again, even if it meant explaining how I knew. However, he demonstrated that his own briefcase, which shuffled around, noises coming from within, was also locked tight. "It's funny," he said to me, "when I was sending them away, wherever I was sending them, I never considered the idea that whatever's on the other side might be able to send things back." I live in the Philippines. This is a story from my childhood. When I was 7 years old, me and my family went to the province of San Jose del Monte, Bulacan, to spend the summer vacation on. The trip was to the family home of my mom's side of the family, a humble 3-story old house renovated to fit the outgrowing neighborhood. When we arrived, my mom was immediately approached by my excited relatives, as it has been a while since we went to the house. While the adults talked, I was greeted by my older cousin Kuya, big brother Ian, and his friend who liked to call Ate, big sister, Joanna. My Kuya Ian and Ate Joanna were close to one another. I actually liked to tease my Kuya about it that he'll develop feelings for her, but he just brushed me off. Me and Ate Joanna, on the other hand, were really close. My relatives used to joke how I actually act like her sometimes. We have the same hobbies, music taste, and behavior to some extent. One day during our 5-day-long trip, my Lolo, Grandpa Uring, was inviting me along with my Kuya Ian and Ate Joanna to the family-owned banana plantation. I was skeptical with tagging along, especially with the fact that it was 7:45 p.m. that night, but my Kuya urged me that it was fine. The family plantation is a private property that you can really only enter via the opening on the side of a major highway. He claimed that no one was going to bother entering through a random opening on the side of the road, which leads down a grassy pathway. So with boredom in my head and my old tablet in my hands, I went with them. When we arrived to the opening in the highway, we went down a short flight of stairs to go to the bottom where the plantation was. When we got to the bottom, I was astounded with how wide the plantation looked, especially with the new angle. My Lolo Uring took me to the old Bahay Kubo, or old wooden house as we Filipinos like to call it. It was actually pretty well maintained for something deep in the woods. It even has a bedroom. As I Saturday down, my Kuya Ian and Ate Joanna went off to collect some ripe bananas ready for harvest. My Lolo Uring said that he'll call me if he needs my help. So I just sat alone in the Bahay Kubo with my tablet, playing Fruit Ninja as my Lolo Uring also went off. As the time went on, I can't help but notice the weird noise in the back of my mind. I thought it was just me until my senses finally kicked in, confirming that something was outside and it's the one making the rustling. It was a small and minor sound, so I just thought that it was just a group of chickens plucking the ground for food. But the sound got louder. I felt the source of it moving from place to place. I wasn't just the rustling bushes anymore. It was now making this weird growling mixed with random talking-ish noise. As it got louder, I couldn't contain my curiosity and thoughts anymore, so I went outside to check. As I got to the front door, the noise stopped and everything seemed to go back to normal. Even the sound of the cicadas went back, contrast to earlier, where they all just went quiet. But as I went to the back of the Bahay Kubo, it all started to go quiet again. The rustling and weird noise also stopped, but it was replaced with an eerie feeling. As I peeked over the back of the Bahay Kubo, I saw nothing. At first, it was just another group of banana trees, but as I squinted my eyes, I noticed there was something out of place among the trees. I thought it was just another banana tree, a dead one, I thought, but as I went closer, I realized it was a person. I was skeptical at first to myself if it was really a person. We Filipinos are not really tall people, but whoever was standing next to the banana tree was practically on par with its height. Scrap that. It was taller than it. I talked to it since it was trespassing my family's property. Translated, "Sir, what are you doing here? This is private property. You can't stay here. You have to leave." I found myself pretty dumb for that question. I should have asked what in the world it was doing in a random banana plantation 8:30 in the night. Before I could continue, it moved. The things in its side which I thought were branches, especially with how disfigured the look, were actually his arms. It fidgeted a bit, before finally looking over its shoulder. Its eyes were black, and the pupil was replaced with a deep white color. I was absolutely horrified at that fact alone. I was frozen on the wooden floorboards of the Baha'i Kubo as it finally moved its body and walked towards me. As it walked, I got a good look at just how tall it was. It would put some NBA players to shame as it crouched down over to my eye level. I was around 5'3" back then. It was wearing a tattered shirt, the ones you would expect a 14th century peasant would wear during the Black Plague. I couldn't react or think anymore as it stared deep into my soul with its black and white eyes. And then it happened. It smiled at me, a smile that would make the Joker run for his money. It stretched out from cheek to cheek. Its teeth were huge and fully white. It was straighter than a military parade. I couldn't stress myself hard enough to explain the absolute horror I felt at that moment. I could become a billionaire and still never remove that image from my mind. It leaned closer to me. It was about to put its humongous hands at the sides of my head. The nails alone were half the size of my hands, but I felt like it was about to squeeze my entire head with its palms. I couldn't move. I was frouncing in fear. At that moment, something pulled me back as I saw the thing's face kicked backward as it fell to the ground with a loud thud. It was my 8 Joanna. She pulled me in her arms and screamed into the background. Translated, Ayan! The kamagong. A kamagong, or velvet tree, is a renowned tree in the Philippines, famous for its strength and durability. At that moment, my kuya Ian lunged out from the plantation in the background with a kamagong tree bark and stabbed the thing right in its heart. It screamed in absolute agony. The kamagong bark drilled into its heart as it oozed out a black liquid. As my kuya Ian backed away towards our position, he was visibly shook too. I was hugging my 8 Joanna so hard, I was practically glued to her. As she was hugging me back, I can also feel her body shaking in fear over what was happening. The thing stopped shaking and screaming. It was starting to stand up. Translated, run. It's still not dead. My kuya Ian screamed to us before I could react. My 8 Joanna picked me up and bolted out of the plantation up towards the highway. I was a pretty tall and heavy kid for my age, but I guess the adrenaline got the best of her. As I looked over her shoulder, I got a good look of what was happening as we were running up the staircase. I could see the thing stand up in rage. It lunged its arms at my kuya Ian in an intent to kill, but my kuya Ian dodged through the opening between its arms and torso. My kuya Ian grabbed another kamagong back from its pocket, and this time stabbed it in the neck as it fell down to the ground. My kuya Ian was no longer taking any chances and repeatedly stabbed it multiple times in the neck. Its screams were now distorted. It went from loud, horrifying scream at first, to an adult man scream, to a scream of a young, to what sounded like a pig being slaughtered, and then finally, what seemed to be demonic low-pitched, loud growling. As I lost vision of my kuya Ian, my 8 Joanna finally got us both up to the highway. My lolo Uring was there. He was staring intently at the ground and leaning at the back of his pickup truck that was carrying the banana harvest that night. As my 8 Joanna sat me down on the truck, she calmed me down and assured everything was. I asked what will happen to kuya Ian was, and she replied, translated, your kuya Ian went through many things to be worried about some demonic entity on his family's plantation. She gave me a slight kiss on the forehead before running back down the highway. I looked at my lolo Uring, and he was staring the length of the highway and giving it a death stare. He was acting really calm, I thought to myself. There's no way he didn't hear that thing's screams. He probably did. But what was making him think that deep to himself? I couldn't really process anything anymore. I passed out on the back of the pickup truck as my lolo Uring finally got to his senses. I felt him carrying me inside the pickup truck before I finally lost consciousness. The next morning, I woke up surprisingly early at 8 a.m. I went over to the terrace and saw my lolo Uring having breakfast with pandesal, traditional Filipino bread, and Nescafe. I sat down next to him and thought about what just happened last night. The rest of my family is gone. My lolo Uring started to talk. Translated. They all left to the palenque, wet market, to buy stock for next week. You're probably in shock and wondering what happened last night, aren't you? I nodded. That was a demon. Not a fairy tale demon, an actual demon. Demons cannot travel to the surface of the earth as we are under the grace of the gods. But humans, they have the capabilities of becoming the medium for demons. We humans, when we are under extreme stress, emotions, or feelings of wanting and needing something, we are exposed to demons looking for a way to the surface world. Demons appear to us as what we want, trying to trick us into making a deal with them in exchange for what we need. But in reality, they just want our bodies. In awe and disbelief, I asked where my Kuya Ian and 8 Joanna were. My Lolo Yuring said that they were at the plantation burying the body in a proper manner in order for the possessed soul to rest in peace. I asked for some money to commute my way over as the plantation, and he actually gave me some. I rode a jeepney or traditional Filipino transport on my way to the plantation. As I went down, I saw my Kuya Ian and 8 Joanna praying at the spot where the demon was killed. They put a cross on top of it for assurance. My presence was immediately seen, and they went over to me in a calm manner, contrast to their usual rowdy behavior. We were just about to leave until I remembered. I completely forgot about my tablet. I asked for them to wait as I went back into the Bahay Kubo and picked it up from the couch. As I picked it up, though, I felt like it was brand new. The screen felt smooth and without traces of old use, despite being 3 years old and in constant state of use. The tablet was laid on the couch before I picked it up, and I saw a string of sampaguita flowers on top of it, and on the wall, the word Salamat was written, which means thank you in Tagalog. I asked my Kuya Ian about it as he entered the house, but he looked confused at what I said about the word on the wall. As I looked back, I saw the word on the wall was gone. We went back to the house, and the entire trip went calm for the next few days until we left. My family was not told about what happened that night. Fast forward to now. I'm now a teen writing this. My Kuya Ian and 8 Joanna are now engaged. I'm happy for them, of course. But then I thought, with a life experience like that, I'd be more shocked if they just cut each other off like nothing happened. At the family meet as orchestrated by my Kuya Ian and 8 Joanna, I saw my Lolo Yuring standing at the terrace, was again eating pandesal and Nescafe. I Saturday down next to him. He then said if I remembered that night that happened 8 years ago. I was moved about what he had said. It felt so random and out of place. I respectfully replied yes and asked, why? My Lolo Yuring started to talk. Translated, I never really told anyone this, even your Kuya Ian. But when the banana plantation was still small and taken care of by my father, he had a friend who offered to be the caretaker of the land in the night, as back then thieves would often steal food from plantations due to scarcity. My father's friend's name was Rodel, and according to my father, he was the nicest person he knew. He was kind, respectful, and a family man. Rodel would often repay small favors with big payments, but Rodel is often in challenges, often working more than one job in order to support his family. One morning, when my father went to the plantation, Rodel was nowhere to be found. His family was heartbroken, as the only thing left was his tattered clothes and a mysterious black liquid splattered on the back of the Bahay Kubo you stayed in. My Lolo Yuring ended our conversation with, I still remember how much my father was told thank you by Rodel. We weren't the first to visit the cabin. That much became clear when we found the diary. Our group had been looking for a remote retreat, somewhere to escape the daily grind. A secluded cabin, found deep in the woods with no phone reception, seemed perfect. We arrived with high hopes, ready for a week of relaxation. But from the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. The cabin was old and dusty, with a musty smell lingering in the air. It was immediately clear that no one had stayed here for a long time. But it was the diary we found on the table, half buried under a pile of old newspapers, that caught our attention. The pages were worn and yellowed, the ink smudged but still readable. We took turns reading aloud, and as we did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The diary's entries were written in a daily basis, describing events that made our blood run cold. This is what the diary said. Mike and I had been drowning in work for what felt like an eternity. Deadlines, meetings, endless tasks. It was a relentless grind that left us both exhausted, our minds frayed and our spirits dulled. The constant pressure had worn us down to the bone, and when we finally got a week off, it felt like a lifeline thrown to drowning men. Mike's uncle owned a cabin deep in the woods, far from the city, with no phone reception and nothing but the forest for miles. It was the perfect escape, a place where time moved slower, and the worries of the world couldn't reach us. We loaded the car with supplies early in the morning, leaving behind the concrete jungle, the endless noise, and the suffocating chaos of the city. The farther we drove, the more it felt like we were shedding the weight of our lives, leaving behind the stress, the exhaustion, and the ceaseless demands. The road narrowed as we ventured deeper into the woods, the trees growing taller and thicker, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air became dense with the scent of pine, earthy and fresh, filling our lungs with each breath. It felt as if the forest was closing in around us, wrapping us in its embrace, drawing us into its depths. The cabin appeared suddenly, a solitary structure nestled in the heart of the forest, surrounded by a sea of trees. It was old, with weathered wood and a sloping roof, the windows dark and still. As we pulled up, a strange feeling washed over me, a sensation that we were entering a different world, a place untouched by time, where the rules of reality no longer applied. The first night was peaceful. We unpacked our bags, lit a fire in the old stove, and settled in with a bottle of whiskey we had brought along. The cabin was small, with creaky wooden floors that groaned underfoot and walls that seemed to breathe with the weight of years. There was something comforting about its age, as though it had seen countless visitors before us and kept their secrets, guarding them in the shadows. The fire crackled in the stove, casting a warm glow over the room, and we talked about everything and nothing, letting the stress of our lives melt away. The whiskey warmed our insides, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. But as the night wore on, something strange began to happen. It started with an odd smell, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the scent of decay, like something long dead and forgotten. We shrugged it off, blaming it on the old cabin or perhaps a dead animal nearby. But as the hours passed, the smell grew stronger, more pervasive. It clung to our clothes, our skin, and lingered in the air even after we left the room. No matter where we went in the cabin, the smell followed us, an invisible presence that we couldn't escape. The next day, we decided to explore the surrounding woods, hoping the fresh air would clear our heads and banish the lingering unease. The forest was thick, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels, their branches knitting together to block out the sun. The further we walked, the denser the forest became, the path winding and twisting as though the woods themselves were leading us somewhere, drawing us deeper into their embrace. We stumbled upon the clearing almost by accident, a barren patch of ground in the middle of the woods, where the trees were blackened and twisted, their trunks charred as if by some intense heat. The ground was scorched, the earth cracked and dry, as though the life had been sucked out of it. In the center of the clearing lay a deer, its body contorted in an unnatural position, its skin peeled back to reveal muscle and bone. But there was no blood. The ground beneath it was dry, as though whatever had done this had drained it completely. "What could have done this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the words catching in my throat. Mike didn't answer. He was staring at the deer, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear and something else, something I couldn't quite place. His hands were trembling, the knuckles white as he clenched his fists. We didn't linger long. The smell of decay was overwhelming now, thick in the air, driving us back towards the cabin. That night, the smell returned, stronger than ever. It seeped through the walls, through the floor, filling every corner of the cabin with its sickly sweet scent. We tried to ignore it, to convince ourselves it was just the old wood, the musty air. But sleep was impossible. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting and shifting in the flickering firelight. their shapes unnatural. Wrong. The silence was deafening, pressing in on us, broken only by a low, distant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Mike was the first to hear it. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling, his eyes darting around the room. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then it came, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from outside. It was slow, deliberate, as if something was trying to get in, testing the walls, the windows, looking for a way inside. We grabbed a flashlight and the hunting knife Mike had found earlier and huddled together, our breaths shallow, our hearts pounding in our chests. We listened, straining to hear, but nothing came. The scratching stopped just before dawn, leaving us in a tense, uneasy silence that hung heavy in the air. The next day, we tried to leave, to escape the suffocating presence of the cabin and the forest. But no matter which direction we took, the road seemed to loop back on itself, leading us in circles until we found ourselves back at the cabin, the trees closing in tighter each time. It was as if the forest was alive, a living, breathing entity that had trapped us within its grasp, twisting the path until there was no way out. The walls of the cabin, once comforting in their old age, now felt like a cage, closing in around us, the air thick with the scent of decay. Mike began to change after that. He grew distant, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes hollow and sunken. He stopped eating, stopped talking, and spent hours staring at the walls, muttering to himself in a voice I couldn't understand. At night, I could hear him scratching at his arms, as if trying to peel something off his skin, his nails digging into his flesh until it bled. On the fourth night, I woke up to find Mike standing by the window, staring out into the darkness, his breath fogging the glass. "It's inside me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his words sending a chill down my spine. "What is?" I asked, dread curling in my stomach, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't answer, just lifted his shirt, revealing his chest. Beneath the skin, something moved, writhing and twisting, as if trying to escape, as if it was alive. I recoiled in horror, bile rising in my throat as I backed away. "We need to get out of here," I stammered, my voice trembling, my hands shaking. But Mike shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips, his eyes glassy, unfocused. "There's no leaving," he said, his voice tinged with madness, his words echoing in the silence. "It's part of us now." The cabin, the forest, it was all connected, part of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for us, drawing us in. The smell, the clearing, the twisted trees, they were all signs, warnings we had ignored. And now it was too late. We were trapped, caught in the web of something we couldn't understand, something that was slowly consuming us. That night, I stayed up, unable to sleep, my eyes fixed on the shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The smell was everywhere, filling my lungs, seeping into my skin, into my mind. I could feel it now, under my skin, crawling through my veins. A sickness that no medicine could cure, but I fought it, clinging to the last shreds of my sanity, the last remnants of who I was. But I'm still here. Mike is gone, vanished into the forest, but I remain. The smell is inside me, the scratching in my mind. But I fight it. I stay awake, keep the fire burning, because I know that once the light goes out, it will take me too. The fire is my only defense, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks, it all blurs together, time losing all meaning in this place. The road still leads back to the cabin, the trees closing in tighter each time I try to leave, their branches clawing at me, pulling me back. But I'm still alive. I write this down, hoping that someone will find it, that someone will understand what happened here, that they will heed my warning. But the fire is dying now, the flames flickering, casting long shadows that dance on the walls. The scratching is getting louder, the sound of nails on wood, the smell stronger, filling every breath, every thought. I can feel it growing inside me, but I won't let it win. I can't. I'll fight it until the end, until there's nothing left of me to fight. If you find this, don't come looking for me. Don't come here at all. Just stay away. This place, it's not what it seems. It's a trap, a snare, waiting for those who are foolish enough to enter. And once you're here, there's no escape, no way out. Only the smell, the scratching, and the darkness that waits. When we finished reading, a heavy silence settled over us. The diary's contents were horrifying, but we initially dismissed them as elaborate fiction, one of those local legends designed to scare off visitors. It seemed too fantastical, too outlandish to be taken seriously. However, as we lingered in the cabin's oppressive atmosphere, thick, suffocating, and cold, we began to feel a creeping sense of dread. "We need to get out of here," someone finally said, their voice barely a whisper, cracking with fear. We packed up quickly, the diary carefully wrapped and stowed away. The road back felt endless, the trees pressing in as if trying to keep us there. The oppressive sense of being watched never left us, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Back in the safety of our own homes, we debated what to do with the diary. It felt too dangerous to simply discard, so we turned it over to local authorities, hoping they could investigate and perhaps put an end to the horrors described within. Months later, one of our friends, skeptical and curious, decided to visit the cabin on a dare. He was determined to prove that the diary was just a hoax. We tried to dissuade him, but his resolve was unshakable. He went alone, armed with nothing but his bravado and a camera. He never came back. A search party was sent, but all they found was the cabin, eerily quiet and untouched. In a room, they discovered a roughly written note on a single page, scrawled in a hurried, trembling hand. It read almost the same as the diary. "If you are reading this, then you are in the same place I was. The darkness is real. It watches, it waits, and it consumes. I thought I could escape. But the forest is not so forgiving. The smell, the scratching, it's all true. It has taken me. I am no longer in control. If you value your life, leave now. The forest never forgets. And once you're trapped, there's no escaping its grasp. Burn this note and never return. The darkness will claim you just as it claimed me." The discovery of the note only deepened the mystery. It was as though the forest had claimed him just as it had the others before him. The cabin remains a place of eerie legend. According to local law, anyone who stays there for more than one night vanishes without a trace, leaving only whispers of their final moments. If you're reading this, take heed. We escaped, but the forest might still be waiting, patient and eternal. The diary's warnings are real, and the darkness in those woods is unforgiving. Be cautious. Never venture into those woods. The fear lingers, and the scratching echoes in our minds. We left with our lives, but who knows if the forest will ever truly let go of those who dare to disturb its silence. I sat today at my sturdy oak desk, willing a creative spark to caress my brain, without much luck. Writer's block had encased me for over a week now in its merciless hold, and my next book was promised to be completed by next week. I sighed, sparking up another cigarette and staring blankly at the unfinished novel on my screen. You'd assume with 2 novels and a mini-series of books already published that I'd be better than this by now. But the stress and deadlines from my publishers have sucked all the creative energy out of me. My self-loathing was interrupted by a soft knock at my apartment door, forcing me out of my anxious void. I pull myself off the leather chair and walk towards the door, expecting to be greeted by my roommate who'd forgotten his keys again. But instead, I open the door to find nobody. I turn my head left and right, perplexed by this lack of presence, and am about to close the door when I notice a small gift bag on the floor. "Ah, fan mail," I mutter to myself, almost mustering a smiling. What's a failing artist without their petite clan of dedicated followers? I picked up the bag and retreated back inside. I peek inside the bag, willing it to be something alcoholic, or at bare least, not a dog shit. A beige, circular object peeked back at me. I reach in to inspect it, holding it up. It was a wooden carousel, decorated with jet black horses. Underneath it was a winding mechanism. A music box. How unusual. And I thought to myself, carrying the carousel with me back to my desk. Well, let's see if a soft tune can ignite my mind. I began winding the bass, setting it down next to my laptop to hear an unfamiliar, distorted melody. I guess it's broken, I sigh. At least we have that in common. Hey! Hey! Are you okay? I slowly opened my eyes, the lamp in the living room burning my eyes like the sun. I just got home from work and you were on the floor. What happened? My roommate Graham knelt beside me, a look of genuine concern on his face. Uh-huh, I spluttered, feeling groggy and confused. Graham helped me to the sofa, where he gently guided me down. Have you eaten today? How long were you out? Graham asked. I glanced at the clock, rubbing my neck. About 3 hours. Graham walked to the kitchen to pour me a glass of water. You need to take better care of yourself, he told me sternly. You get yourself stressed out and don't eat or sleep. It's not good for you. Graham forbade me from using my laptop for the rest of the evening, insisting I instead have a bath while he prepares us dinner. We sat opposite each other at our small dining room table, eating quietly. I broke the silence with the usual question of, how was work? Graham sighed, pushing his pasta around his plate with his fork. It was shit. The boss was an asshole to me all day, and the customers were as horrible as ever. I swear I could kill the lot of them and burn the place down if it didn't pay the bills. We both laughed. So, what about you? Surely something interesting happened to you besides passing out for hours? Graham teased. I shrug. I got some weird fan mail earlier. Well, I assume it's from a fan anyways. It's that strange carousel music box on my desk. Fuck knows what it plays. Some warped sound or something. Must just be some broken thing someone didn't want. Bizarre, Graham replied, as we continued eating. I went to bed not long after dinner. Per Graham's instruction, I actually woke up feeling rather refreshed. An unusual occurrence for me. I stretched, got dressed and headed into the kitchen for my morning coffee. Beverage in hand, I sauntered over to my computer desk to try and conquer the writer's block with my new fresh outlook on the day. I see a small post-it note stuck to the corner of my desk and pluck it from its position. Morning. I took that carousel thing into work to see if I can fix it on my break. Don't overdo it today. See you tonight. I smile, placing the note back down and taking a moment to appreciate Graham while my laptop booted up. An email from my editor instantly flashed up on screen. Oh, great, I muttered as I opened it. He's going to be on my case about getting this thing finished. My eyebrow raised as I began to scan the email. Whoa, that's early for your deadlines. Nice work for getting it done in time. It's quite a bit. Well, darker than your usual stuff, but I'm sure we can make work with some editing, maybe. I don't really understand why you've gone down this route, but we can fix it. Just leave it with me, and don't send any drafts to the publisher until we can figure this out. Okay? What? I say out loud, and am about to reply when an email from my publisher pops up. Hello. We have received your final copy of your recent novel, and we must say we don't find it appropriate. The content seems very violent and personally threatening, and upon further discussion, it is with great sadness that we must terminate your contract with us. This is very unfortunate, as we have enjoyed working with you and had high hopes for your upcoming work. We wish you well in your future. My heart felt like it was in my throat, and I began reaching for my phone to call them and explain how there must be a mistake, when I noticed the file I'd attached. It was dated yesterday, around the time I'd assumed I was unconscious. The story that I'd once had written on the page about a fantasy medieval world was gone, and in its place was a vulgar, graphic slew of the detailed methods on how I wanted to torture each individual publisher in the company. I felt sick to my stomach as I read the disgusting ways I was harming them, committing unmentionable violent attacks on the staff. I pushed my computer chair back and got up shakily to find my phone, desperate to fix this and find who was responsible. On my way to my room, I noticed the gift bag still on the floor by the living room table. There was a note inside which I hadn't seen yesterday. I reached down and pulled it out, reading the handwritten note. With this device, all your thoughts can come true. An artist can paint whatever image is in their mind. A chef can cook any dish they envision. A writer can put to words all the thoughts scattered in their head. But be cautious. Not all thoughts should be let into this world. My eyes widen as I piece together what this meant. I drop the note and run for my room to my phone, but a loud knock at the door stops me in my tracks. I walk to the door, heart pounding, to find 2 police officers stood in the doorway. We're looking for Graham Opson. We understand this is his residence. One of them tells me sternly, yes, he lives here, but he's at work. Why, what's wrong? I splutter, barely able to get the words out. The officers exchange a look. Before glancing back at me, I step aside and tell them to look around. They do so, and within 10 minutes we're all stood in the living room with me firmly asking what's going on and if Graham is okay. One of the officers let out a sigh. Mr. Opson is wanted for the murder of several people and the arson of his workplace. We've been tracing him on CCTV for an hour, but he's managed to escape. If you see him or he makes contact, please let us know. The officers left soon after, and I sat on the sofa in a daze for what must have been hours. I snapped back to reality when I heard a key in the door. It was Graham. Evening. Sorry I'm late. I woke up passed out in the woods for some reason. Maybe one of my bastard co-workers spiked my soda. Or maybe what you had yesterday is some sort of virus that I've caught. Graham walked into the living room and perched on the sofa next to me. You all right? You look a bit pale. Maybe we both just need some time off. Oh, by the way, I didn't have any luck fixing that music box. It really does sound distorted though, doesn't it? I hope you don't mind, but I gave it to a co-worker who left at lunchtime. He's good with these sorts of things and might get it working. Lucky bastard booked half the day off for his kid's birthday party. Anyways, shall we have a takeaway tonight? I'd kill for some fried chicken. Thank you. I'm worried something is going to happen to me. As I write this, I can't help but turn to look out the window to check if they're there or not. It's 1 o'clock in the morning and I can't go back to sleep. Beforehand, I should tell you more about myself and these people before I delve in deeper. My family, or more precisely, my grandma owns a patch of land out in the countryside, where my parents built a family house where we come every summer to get away from unbearable summer heat waves in the city, usually towards the end of June. From what I remember, my grandma was in possession of the said patch since 1980 or 1981, I'm not really sure. Next to our patch of land was my aunt's patch of land, but nothing was ever built on it, and the patch next to it was empty up until 2 years ago when someone bought the said patch to build a family house on it. Last year, my father came into my room and asked me to dress up nicely and come downstairs to greet our new neighbors, who bought the mentioned patch of land. Upon meeting my new neighbors, the parents seemed nice enough, though they also appeared to be a bit annoying, given their lack of mannerisms since they were country folk, but I didn't mind too much. From that point, I personally didn't interact with them much. They mostly stayed on their property, getting some work done, like for example, building a shed, then a greenhouse. I eventually learned they had 4 children, ages 17, 15, 13 and 11. I was older than all of them, so I didn't feel the need to meet them, since I had no common topics of interest to discuss with them, given that they were all teenagers and kids, while I am a 25-year-old man, so now you see why. My first encounter with one of them was when I was sitting in my front yard. I was suntanning when the youngest of the bunch was walking the family dog, an alibi across my aunt's property. I remember the kid calling out to me and I looked at him. "Hey you, what's your name?" the kid asked in a friendly manner as he forced the dog to come to a stop. "Chris, and you are?" I forced myself to greet the kid so I didn't come off as rude while lifting my sunglasses from my eyes. "Name's Danny, nice to meet you," he said. I remember nodding my head and slipping my sunglasses back on, thinking the interaction was going to end there, but I was wrong. "Just let me get my dog back to the house and I'll be right over," Danny said, as he then dragged the dog off back to the house of his parents. In a few minutes, he was right on my property as he Saturday down on the grass besides me. I had to admit, I was really uncomfortable, as I was way older than this kid. I'm in my 20s, yet this kid is 11 and not hesitant to approach me. I couldn't force myself to shoo him away just yet, to not be rude, since he was one of my neighbor's kids. The whole time we talked, the conversation just felt weird. I had no common topics with this kid at all, so he had to do most of the talking. Did you know I shot 3 birds in one day when I was up on a tree? How cool is that? Danny bragged on, while I simply just agreed. This kid had some kind of off-putting energy about him. I didn't know what it was, but something about him made me feel even more tense. He was a kid, but the feeling was there. I once saw my dad taxidermy a wolf that our alibi was able to tear apart, and then he taught me how to taxidermy a fox. Danny continued to brag on. I wanted to call out Danny on his lies and exaggerated stories, but he was only 11, so I decided not to berate the kid, and I just barely listened to him at all. Then he left around lunchtime, and the feeling persisted even after, as I knew there was something wrong with this kid. I didn't get to meet the other 3, but I overheard rumors from my dad that the eldest, 17, is a bit of an alcoholic, and that his dad doesn't seem to mind the fact that his son is hardly of age. The next time I encountered the youngest, along with the rest of his brothers, was during lunch. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I remember going to the bathroom to use the toilet, and when I was done, something in my stomach was urging me to look out the window above the toilet. I climbed onto the closed toilet lid and looked out the window to spot 4 kids near the edge of the forest. One of them I immediately recognized to be the youngest, and they were huddled close together, stealing glances to each other every now and then while facing my house. This unnerved me a bit for some reason, even though I wanted to believe these kids must have been commenting on my family house and whatnot. On the other end, something told me these kids were talking about me and that they could see me looking back at them. I left the bathroom and decided to shrug off the incident. 3 days later, I was doing my usual exercising to lose some weight, and the sun was burning rather intensely. I retreated back into the family house to continue exercising there, and when I finished exercising, I went to my bedroom. My eyes accidentally locked onto my bedroom window, and I got that same nagging feeling to look out the window that somebody was out there. My body slowly crept towards the window as I leaned down and looked carefully through the blinds. There I saw the kids again. What unsettled me this time was they were closer to the family house and not at the edge of the forest anymore. All 4 of them stood next to each other, facing... I don't really remember. I couldn't tell if they were facing my family house or my window specifically, but their gazes were haunting and intense, as if they were expecting something to happen. They stood next to each other, still like soldiers awaiting for a commander to bark orders at them. That night, I brought up the concern with the kids' bizarre behavior to my parents, and they laughed it off. I remember them telling me to relax, that they are just kids and are probably toying around with me, and I should just let it go. The 3rd encounter with the kids was the most frightening one I've ever had, and that was yesterday at 2 in the morning. That day, I was exhausted from working out and had fallen asleep at around 10 p.m. I woke up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom, and once I was finished, the same nagging urge to look out the window above the toilet invaded my mind. Instinctively, I climbed onto the closed toilet lid silently, peeking my head to look out the window, and nearly screamed. The kids were much closer now, only a few inches away from the back door to the backyard. I couldn't get a look at their faces right away, given how dark it was outside and in the bathroom as well. Once my eyes adjusted, however, I realized their gazes were pointed in my direction, their wide, bloodshot eyes locked onto me, and their facial expressions remained the same as the last time I had seen them. Frozen, haunted, as if they were waiting for someone to give them a command to do something. I was terrified. Something terrifying and dark was lurking beneath their bloodshot eyes, and the fact that they were all neatly lined up next to each other, their arms at their sides, made the whole situation even more horrifying. I remember instinctively running around the house and locking up all the doors and windows, all while my grandma and parents continued to snore away as if they couldn't comprehend the gravity of the situation. I hardly slept that night. Tonight, I'm waiting to see if they will make an appearance again. When I was little, it started. My small, weak nails were just too easy to remove. I could get lost in another world, biting them off, until eventually all that was left were jagged, bloodied stubs. It was a horrible habit that followed me into my teenage years and became a point of contention for my mother. I used to bite mine, you know. Then your aunt got married, and I used this awful stuff that you painted on, and it tasted so bad, it put me off biting them for good. I'll get you some if you like. Then she'd tap her beautiful, strong, natural nails on the table in a show of prowess. I'd look down and hate my jagged stubs. It was unconscious. I didn't even know I was doing it until my exposed nail bed was raw and sore. I tried the stuff. It tasted awful, and still I persevered. I'd never have nice nails. This went on for years, even as I got older and more aware of how I looked. Eventually, I left school and got a job at a mental health charity, and the sudden injection of money spurred my vanity into finally finding a solution to the nail biting. My first set of acrylics were gorgeous, so long they could poke out an eye and filed to deathly point, gold glitter flicked across them. I loved them so much it was like the biting was forgotten. I got my nails done every month after that. I didn't give my natural nails a chance to breathe for years, and I couldn't bite through the thick acrylics, even if I wanted to. It was the perfect solution, and it pleased my mother. "It's so nice to see you being a little bit girly, my beautiful daughter." She'd smile, and it would melt my heart. She'd always wanted a little glamorous mini-me, and instead she got a chubby, nerdy goth who hung out with boys. But I was girly. It was a common ground. Without real bills, as my wages grew, I found new ways to satisfy my need to present myself nicely. The nails stayed groomed, and I got really into makeup, collecting every viral palette on the internet and perfecting highlighting techniques so I could glow like a disco ball. I loved it. It was so much fun, but it was a gateway into the habit that would come to ruin my life and lead me here, asking for help. I'm getting ahead of myself, but my heart is beating so fast my chest might burst. It started with the structured Instagram brow. I know, not the most threatening concept in the world, but for me, it led to my greatest love, the tweezers. I took so much joy in plucking. I'd pluck every hair that seemed to stray from the perfect, crisp line I'd created, and I'll be honest, I even quite enjoyed the pain. It got to a point where all I had was the inner half on one of my brows, because I'd decided the tail didn't grow right and I'd draw it myself every day. And getting those short hairs, the little prickly ones that grew back, it just felt so fucking satisfying. It wasn't like nail biting. People didn't see it as a bad habit. It was just zealous plucking reminiscent of the 90s and their pencil-thin browed generation. In fact, if any friends or family caught me without my perfectly drawn eyebrows and spotted the one that was a tuft, it became a running joke. It was funny. For a while, nothing really changed. I'd stand in the mirror, tweezers gripped firmly between my manicured claws, plucking to my heart's content. I got to keep a weird little habit, and the world saw a nicely groomed young girl. Everyone was a winner. I found the love of my life in that time. I say I found him, but really he was there all along. I fell in love with a boy I'd been friends with for over a decade. We had such a history together, and when it finally took a romantic turn, it just felt so right. We'd get high together, watching movies in his bed, just smiling about the world. I wish I could say it was all blissful, but his living situation wasn't great. His mother, an alcoholic with a shouty partner, created a hostile environment for him to live in, and one I didn't love visiting. Most young couples who move in together as quick as we did are doomed to fail. But we'd known each other so long, it made sense to get him out of there. So my mother cried as I moved into my first flat. I missed home, but my mother and I were so close I wasn't scared. and I had the man of my dreams next to me every night. I kept the love of makeup, but not the disposable income that I'd had with living with a parent. I'd become so accustomed to keeping up with the limited edition releases that the makeup won in a heartbeat, and soon, acrylic nails monthly were just out of my budget. I didn't go back to nail biting. My natural nails were weak after years of extensions and snapped off easily, so they seemed to maintain a normal, short length on their own. Instead, the plucking really took hold. My tailless brow had become nothing more than a stub to show me where to start drawing it in the morning, and the other was greatly thinned. My boyfriend would laugh at the little tuft left behind. Around that time, the chin hair made its first appearance. Don't lie to yourselves, ladies, we've all been there. You stroke your face and suddenly feel a sharp little thick hair that makes you feel as if you're about to grow a lustrous beard. That got plucked too. Every stray hair I deemed too thick or long on my face did. Eventually, my tweezing began to irk my boyfriend. Maybe he realized it was more than just grooming. I don't even think I did back then. Stop plucking them, you've got barely any eyebrow left. I'm going to hide your tweezers. He thought he was being helpful. I know it came from a place of love, and by this point, the structured Instagram brow had been phased out in favor of the fluffy, full ones that were on trend. I couldn't follow that trend, though. There wasn't enough hair left, so when he took the tweezers, I really thought it would help. When I discovered that I could pull out those prickly little hairs that grew back and irritated me to touch, with nothing but my own fingernails, it was a revelation. I'd catch one in the mirror growing outside of the designated tuft I'd left behind, and I'd grip it hard between my thumb and index finger, pulling until it came out. You don't need tweezers. We moved a couple of times, and I left my job to manage a restaurant. Soon I'd stopped caring about my appearance altogether. Between the hours I was working, the comfort levels with my boyfriend, and the lack of disposable income as our bills grew, I stopped buying all the makeup. The only thing I still did was draw my eyebrows on, because I had to. A year into that job, the lockdown hit. I realized just how much I hated restaurant work, so I quit, a week before they introduced furlough. I knew I'd been an idiot, but I was grateful I never had to go back, even if money was tight. We couldn't go anywhere anyway, right? I'm almost ashamed to say I loved lockdown. I know that sounds horrific, but I'm a homebody, and being at home all that time was so good for me after years of not having much of a break. I took up writing. I'd been playing around writing stories for a while, but never really taken it seriously, and lockdown gave me the opportunity to get lost in my characters. My tailless eyebrow even started to grow back. The time that would have been spent nail-biting, tweezing, or pulling out my eyebrows was spent in fantasy worlds. But when the world returned to normality, those fantasy worlds were shattered. I went to work for a care company, thinking it would be a good return to my original industry, but it wasn't. It was depressing, poorly run, and sparked anxieties in me I never knew I had. I started having panic attacks, and that's when the eyebrow pulling turned to picking. By the time I left that job, a quivering mess mid-breakdown, I could barely finish the book a publisher had asked me to write. That shitty job robbed me of the joy of realizing one of my life's greatest dreams. I wish I'd got to enjoy it more. At this point, all I had left was a tuft for either eyebrow. At some point, through the stress, I'd pulled out the feeble tail of the other one, leaving me looking permanently surprised unless they were painstakingly painted on. It's hard to find the will to draw them when you're depressed. Suddenly it wasn't so funny anymore. Can't you just let them grow back? You need to leave them alone. Have you tried getting rid of your tweezers? I'd get those questions all the time. I was too ashamed to admit I was pulling them. It was unconscious, just like the nail biting had been. I'd sit there in the evening watching mind-numbing TV, high as I could get myself, picking at the prickly little hairs desperate to grow back, and that fucking beard hair that tried every time I picked it out. I'd become so fixated that I'd be trying to pull them before there was anything to grip, and would make myself bleed digging at them. Eventually, I came through the crux of the mental health crisis. Got a new job in a sales environment with a load of great people my own age, and for a while, I was actually happy. I hadn't managed to get back to writing, but I was healing. Everything healed but my eyebrows. I've been there for almost 3 years, and all that time I never stopped picking. It wasn't as bad as when I made myself bleed, but it never went away. I just hid it with drawn-on structured Instagram brows. That leads me here. Things got stressful. It doesn't matter how that isn't actually relevant anymore. I'm explaining I was stressed, so you know why the picking got worse again. I don't know what time I started this evening, but my boyfriend is on a night shift. I'm Saturday here, alone watching the telly, and I must have started pulling and digging. I noticed when I pulled out the bit of metal. It resembled a hair, but it was thick and coiled like a tiny spring. Terrified, I pulled again, and there was another. When I run my fingers along my eyebrow line, they're everywhere, thick little fucking metal springs. I feel them stretch as I pull them, and they resist detaching from my face. There's one in place of the chin hair too. I can feel them everywhere. I thought I'd really lost it, but there's a pile of these little metal springs right in front of me. They're real, and every time I pull one, another one grows. There's blood caked around my nails, and I can feel it on my face. I've scoured the internet, paralyzed to my bed, too scared to look in a fucking mirror, and I can't find anything like this. All I found was you guys. You seem to go through some weird shit, and I'm hoping one of you, just one of you, knows what's going on here. I don't think I have long. They're growing. They've formed a curtain now, springing down from my eyebrows, almost covering my eyes. It doesn't matter how quick I pull, they always grow quicker. Fuck, please help me. Maybe things would be better if I'd kept biting my nails. It's easy to overlook signs of your body needing medical attention. Minor back pain or a slight cough, if left unchecked, can rapidly alter into a mass-spread epidemic of uncontrollable proportion. In an Alaskan mountain village, in which my practice is based, this outcome is by all accounts a death sentence for all our residents. Some of you may find it strange how I referenced back pain as being the equivalent of a village death sentence, but in our case, a hunter or fisherman put out of the job for a few weeks means that everyone will suffer. It is for this reason that my role as village doctor is one which I take very seriously, provided the outcome of negligence can equally lead to my own downfall. I've recently encountered an illness that I am unable to recognize or identify via the symptoms displayed. The reach my practice exceeds is limited to the villagers and any injured hikers. For this reason, I am not well versed in more specialized diseases such as cancer and tuberculosis. Instead, my expertise lies in conditions such as the examples I listed above, with things such as back pain, colds, fevers, flu, and the most severe being hypothermia, but this is less common than you would think. The village is rather small, consisting of around 15 buildings made up of homes, schools, markets, and a church. I can't stress enough that despite the titles these buildings hold, they are nothing more than a miniaturized recreation of the real thing. The school is around the size of a single classroom that you would find in England, which is where I'm from, and this is the same for all other institutes, including my clinic, which is made up of a waiting room and a single consultation room, along with a medical equipment and pharmaceutical storage unit. The reason I stress this fact is due to my fears that this disease could hold the potential to spread rapidly throughout the village if I fail in my commitments to identify and eradicate it. Beneath are excerpts from my diary. These should paint a picture of when the disease first occurred. Monday, 19th August 2024. The weather was nicer today than yesterday, but my ankle still hurts from when I walked Benji in the woods. I contacted the natives today to trade bandages and plasters for herbal remedies, since Mrs. Nelson refuses to take anything man-made. She seems in better spirits as of late, and she mentioned that her stomach pain is beginning to cease. Seeing the neighbors' kids playing around outside has made me realize just how much I miss Lisa. I loved her for her smile, her laugh, and the way she made me feel. But I never stopped to think that a part of that love was for the promising future. She fed me each night about starting a family and moving up here in the first place. I miss her every day, and it never gets better. I walked Benji twice today, or more hobbled after him as he darted in between the trees. We did our normal route today, past the stump, over the bridge, and then looping back around when we reached the wet patch, which is beginning to dry a little. Hopefully. The good weather is consistent enough so that me and Benji can start our longer walks again. I saw a deer today in the tree line by the bridge. Haven't seen one in a while. Makes me feel as if I may have been struck with a streak of luck, but I can only wait and see how the weather holds up. On a more serious note, I was contacted by Mountain Rescue today regarding a hiker who has been missing for the past 2 days. They told me that the hiker was a young man, estimated to be around the age of 20 to 30, and had called Mountain Rescue, which the team managed to record. Unfortunately, this is the only lead the rescue team has to go off of. They asked if I could look at the recording and give them an estimation as to what condition he could currently be in, as well as give them an idea as to how much time they had left to find him before he could be ruled out as dead. The recording was largely a concoction of static and intermittent mumbling, which was incomprehensible due to the sound of wind that backdropped the audio. The only things I could make out were the word head, a sort of moan of pain, and then the sound of cracking and snapping before the call gave out. I told them that I believed the man may have become lost before being caught in a storm, given the wind and the sound of what I believed to be branches snapping against the force of the wind, as well as beneath the hiker as he tried to find his way out. The hiker saying the word head could mean he had suffered a head injury, and granted it wasn't too severe. The rescue team should have another day or so to find him. I only hope he's experienced. I don't want to see another young man suffer the consequences of frostbite again this year. Good night, Lisa X. Mitch Walker signing off. Tuesday, 20th August 2024. Weather held up, so the wet patch has dried enough now for me and Benji to extend our walk to the boulders. They say lightning doesn't strike twice in the same spot, but I can't help but feel like this week is going to be one for the memory books, since I saw another deer in the same spot as yesterday. I can't believe my luck. Mistress Nelson told me at her consultation that her stomach pain has gone, which is always good to hear, but she said she's been feeling a little down since her husband Tom didn't come home last night. I feel bad for her. It's not easy being married to a mountain rescue officer, and I suspect my words played an equal part in the all-night search the overseer instructed. It's times like this that I realize I would never have been cut out for that sort of work, trudging through the mud and trees all hours of the day, only to bunker down in a dingy checkpoint bed miles away from home, really doesn't float my boat. The store's shipment was late, so I had to settle on a bowl of porridge for my tea using some powdered milk, which I rehydrated. Benji doesn't seem to know the struggle. I sometimes wish I had the same memory span as him, so I could forget what I ate the day before and enjoy the same meal the very next day over and over again. Rereading that, it just sounds like I want dementia. Good night, Lisa X. Mitch Walker signing off. Wednesday, 21st August, 2024. Hit with a storm during the night, so I was unable to take Benji into the woods, given how muddy the paths have become. I opted to take him along to one of my house visits. I'm grateful for the fact everyone here loves him, otherwise I wouldn't know what to do right about now. Tom was escorted home early this morning by Mountain Rescue due to concerns surrounding his condition. Mrs. Nelson called me to take a look. She greeted me at the door and had clearly been crying before I came. I asked if she was okay, but she replied with a quick nod before wiping the tears from her eyes with a tissue. She escorted me into their bedroom and took Benji into the living room downstairs while flicking on the TV. As far as physical competence, Tom is in his prime and well built. He doesn't seem to have suffered any falls or scrapes while in the woods. Mentally, however, Tom appears severely disturbed. For the hour-long consultation, Tom remained mute. He didn't verbally reply to anything I had to say. I asked if he was in pain, to which he nodded. I asked him to point on his body where the pain was located, to which he pointed at his head. It became clear to me why he had been rubbing his head periodically. I provided him a pen and paper and asked him to write down any other symptoms he was experiencing. He struggled to hold the pen and write on the page, but after a grueling 2 minutes, he managed to scrawl out the word voices. I've prescribed him painkillers for his headache, but I suspect he may be experiencing an abnormal case of hypothermia, which may have taken effect primarily within his cognitive ability, leading to issues surrounding confusion and perception. I didn't stay long, since after coming downstairs with Tom, Benji began whimpering and trying to cover his ears with his paws. I think he may have heard something outside which disturbed him, which isn't any wonder given Tom and Debbie live close to the village's power generator. The monotone buzzing probably sounded like the most terrifying thing imaginable to a dog. Luckily, Benji appeared in better spirits after we left. Good night, Lisa X. Mitch Walker signing off. Thursday, 22nd August, 2024. Today's events are all a blur, but I'll try to commit everything down to paper. Tom's condition has significantly worsened to a degree of unrecognizability. His head has tripled in size. I was unable to walk Benji this morning since I received a call from Mrs. Nelson requesting urgent care for her husband. She was frantic, hysteric. Her voice was almost incomprehensible as her words rapidly fluttered down the line. I didn't understand half of what she said, but I recognized the sound of desperation. When I arrived at the house, Debbie was already at the door, running up her drive to meet me. She was a mess of snot and tears, but she managed to say, "It's Tom. He's not right." I've seen a lot over the years. A man with his leg trapped under a fallen tree, a hiker impaled on his own walking stick, flu, colds, headaches, back pain, but I have never seen this in all my years of medical school. He was still alive, moans of pain escaping his lips every few seconds as his head pulsed. He was laid facing up in bed, his head propped atop a pillow with all the lamps on and positioned to face him. He looked monstrous. The brow of his head protruded out over his eyes, encasing them, so he didn't notice I was in the room. His head was a mess of protruding bone, his skin stretched tight around the shards, acting as his internal body's last defense to being completely exposed. His head throbbed periodically, the mass of his brain sinking low, creating deep crevices around the fragments of his skull before expanding, causing his skin to stretch and split ever so slightly. I alerted him to my presence, but I don't think he could hear me. No matter how loud I shouted, "Tom, Tom, I'm here." He didn't respond. I think a part of his skull had penetrated his eardrums, or at least the pressure of his expanding brain had suppressed my voice reverberating in his ears. I was drenched in sweat, my racing heart pounding in my ears. I was, and still am, at a complete loss. I didn't know what to do for him. When I reached my arm out to his, he began thrashing and screaming, the weight of his head keeping him pinned, only causing him to scream more in pain. I contacted the Providence, Alaska Medical Center, and they agreed to fly out in an air ambulance to transport Tom to keep him under their care. I don't have the necessary treatment to help him here. Debbie accompanied him in the helicopter after thanking me. On a lighter note, the weather's been nice today, so I hope I'll be able to take Benji in the woods tomorrow. God knows he'll be tired of walking around the gravel streets. Good night, Lisa X. Mitch Walker signing off. Friday, 23rd August, 2024. Met with the natives again today. They asked for painkillers for the first time. It's nice to see that they're coming around to what I have to offer besides just bandages. They didn't have anything else to trade since they told me they were in desperate need of all their remedies. They've been extremely helpful for the duration of my time here, so I didn't mind. I told them if they needed anything else, all they need to do is ask. The ground felt drier today after coming down the mountain, so I was able to take Benji into the woods by the time I got back. I feel bad not taking him with me to see the natives, but I feel like he'll struggle clambering over the rocks to reach them. Benji seemed to enjoy his walk, sniffing various plants and sprinting back and forth towards me. But something strange happened in the woods, which continues to play on my mind. I saw another deer today. It was actually in the exact same spot as my previous encounters this week. I can't help but think it could be the same one. It remained rooted to the spot. It didn't even move when I walked up to it. It snorted heavily as I approached, and his body began to tremble slightly, but it never moved, never bolted, turned its head, or closed its eyes. Its eyes were almost frightening, wide and unblinking, streaks of red surrounding the corners. It appeared frail. I don't think it had eaten in a while. In fact, now that I think about it, it sort of looked like when a deer gets caught in a car's headlights. Turned to stone in motionless fear. Whatever it saw out there must have really spooked it. I don't know why, but I wrapped my arms around its head to hug it. I thought it would calm it down, but it didn't. It remained the same as when I approached it, but I began to hear a different sound. I couldn't see its lips as I positioned my head beside its ear, but I swear I heard it mumble something. I darted back, my eyes wide with shock, but it didn't make the sound again, shaking. I embraced it once again. It didn't make a sound, but as soon as my head became level with its ear, the mumbling came back. It sounded as if someone were talking on the other side of a brick wall. The sound of Benji's whimpers broke my focus as I retreated from the deer. My body trembling, I struggled to catch my breath. Benji was staring at the deer beside me, whimpering loudly and trying to cover his ears. Nothing about that walk felt right. My heart racing, I took off in full sprint alongside Benji as we ran like bats out of hell back to our cabin. I didn't have many consultations today, which I'm glad about. After that walk, I don't think I could take much of hearing other people's issues. Good night, Lisa X. Mitch Walker signing off. I was hesitant to take Benji into the woods this morning, but what we saw only strengthened the fears I hold for our village's fate. After yesterday's encounter, I paid more attention to my surroundings. There are more deer in those woods than the one by the bridge. There are hundreds, close, far, some just dots in the distance. All of them remain motionless. The one I saw yesterday has yet to move. Whatever they saw, whatever they were suffering from, is outside my realm of reality. I don't know if we caught it from them, or them us, but more of Mountain Rescue have returned home. They've all been escorted off the mountain by their team before being left at home, and their colleagues venturing back into the mountain. Everyone escorted is suffering from headaches. I'm terrified by the events in store for our village. I can't abandon them in this state. Lisa would never forgive me after I meet her in the afterlife. Has anyone encountered this sort of thing before? I could really do with your help. A couple of years ago, I was dating a woman named Lynn. She was deeply enthusiastic about alternative medicine. It was such a strange obsession. In every other aspect, she was insightful and critical. Hell, she was a paralegal. She just had this one blind spot that I could never figure out, and it was a big part of her life. We were together for 2 years. During that time, she had me try all kinds of strange treatments and experiences. Things like acupuncture, spirit healing, crystals, Reiki, Rolfing, and even a seance. I may or may not have been asked to do ayahuasca. I went along with it because I cared deeply for her, but the cracks in our relationship had started to show. Turned out we wouldn't last in the long run. But I don't want to talk about that relationship. I want to talk about this one treatment she took me to, and how it has shaped the life I'm living today. It's a bit complicated. I'm going to talk about step-minding. It was an early Minnesota morning, and the last session that Lynn and I would attend as a couple. We pulled into a nondescript parking lot, and Lynn led me by the hand. We'd had an insane fight that morning about something I can barely remember. I think it was the order you put in your yogurt when eating muesli. Of course you put the muesli in first, right? It's like cereal. We entered a stale waiting room. The AC must have been off for days. I could taste the air. The only other person there was a short, balding man who spoke to us in a vaguely European accent, barely looking up from his iPad. "Stevenson's?" he asked. "Overexposure is room 4. "No, that's not us," I said. "We're—" Right, sorry," he sighed. "Wrong day." He tapped the screen a couple of times and nodded. "Step-minding couples treatment, still room 4. "Thank you." He wandered off, and I noticed he didn't have any shoes on. I pointed it out to Lynn, who elbowed me. She thought I was being judgmental. I just thought it was strange. I didn't want to start anything. She vehemently disagreed with my assessment, as always. We walked up to room 4. The door was already open. It was a plain, windowless room with a small coffee table surrounded by 4 basic office chairs. There was a vase with a single blue sunflower. There was a naked light bulb overhead with nothing covering it. The floor was covered in a plain grey carpet. There was a little note on the door that urged us to take off our shoes. Lynn just smiled at me, as if this explained everything. I rolled my eyes. We sat down across from one another and waited. It didn't take that long before a woman wandered in. She was in her 40s, wearing a sort of knitted white wool caftan. She had a combed-back flat Elvira-looking hairdo and covered herself in rings, chains and bangles. She shook our hands, smiling widely. "I'm Dr. Bogan," she assured us, "but please call me Jane." I wasn't feeling all too confident about what we were about to do. Jane described the procedure. Step-minding was a way to connect to one another in a new way, giving a better understanding of what it's like to walk a mile in their shoes. There were a couple of rules to remember before we started. For example, once the treatment started, we couldn't get up from our chairs. If we did, we'd get horribly nauseous. Also, we had a sort of safety noise. If someone were to snap their fingers 3 times in a sequence, that'd trigger a fail-safe that brought us right back. All in all, it seemed odd, but not like nefarious. Then we began. Jane rhythmically snapped her fingers, like someone tapping their feet to a slow song. She spoke in a monotone voice, asking us to look down. "Look at your feet," she said. "Imagine the feeling of walking, the way your muscles contract and your knee bends. Think of how it makes you feel, and imagine the sound you think your body makes." I don't remember the exact wording of what she told us next, but I remember how it made me feel. Without moving, we were supposed to imagine standing up, stepping across and through the coffee table, and sitting down in the chair of the person on the other side, our spirit passing through them, occupying the same space. We were to imagine looking at ourselves through the eyes of the other. There was a breathing exercise following the rhythm of her finger snapping. We joined our breaths, and Jane made us focus on each part of our body, leading from our toes up to the top of our heads. She called it materializing. We kept our eyes on our feet, except, slowly, they weren't my feet anymore. "Now look," Jane said. "Look at yourself." I was looking down at Lynn's feet, but not through my eyes. I have a hard time describing the first sensation of step-minding. Jane's finger snapping stopped, and all of a sudden I was looking up at, well, myself. I was sitting in Lynn's chair. I was, for all intents and purposes, experiencing the world as Lynn. I was Lynn. My hands were smaller, more delicate. I was colder, and my clothes were uncomfortable. Smell and taste felt different, and I had this gnawing hunger in the back of my stomach. My back ached, and I could feel my long hair reaching halfway down my back. I wasn't just looking at Lynn's feet, I was Lynn. I can barely remember what I did. We talked and touched each other's hands, reassuring one another that we were actually experiencing this. Lynn was repeating the same thing over and over. "That's me," she said. "I'm looking at me. You're me. I'm you." We had a long discussion. I could feel air reverberating through my throat in a strange way. I spoke with Lynn's voice, and it made my neck strain. I had to settle myself in her body, and there were so many details that just didn't click. It was so hard to focus on what was being said when all I could think about was the way my earrings swung back and forth when I moved my head. But after about an hour, Jane snapped her fingers 3 times, and I was back in my chair in the blink of an eye. This is how I realized I was short-sighted. Lynn's vision had been perfect. I also felt bigger, heavier. Her world felt so different from mine, and while it didn't explain our disagreements, it gave me some insights into just how different we really were. I made a note to get new glasses. Still reeling from the experience, Lynn and I thanked Dr. Bogan and stepped out. We had a strange, disoriented talk in the parking lot and broke up. It was oddly amicable, as if we both understood that we were fundamentally incompatible. That was it. No drama, just that's it. I thought about that day for weeks. It was so surreal. I mean, how do you go from a literal out-of-body experience and back to work on Monday morning? You can't pretend that nothing happened. I wanted to understand it, like really understand it. I'd been to countless nonsensical treatments with Lynn, but this one had been the real deal. There was no denying it, even though I desperately tried to. A couple of weeks later, I returned to Dr. Bogan on my own. I wanted to talk to her about it, the science behind it, how it functioned, how it was performed, anything. And of course, how had I never heard of step-minding before? I met her on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. She sat me down and had her assistant offer me a cup of coffee. She explained it as calmly as she could. It was complicated, but essentially she explained it as something based on Raskian identity theory. The transfer of thought pattern through vocal mediation, exchanging vibrations and adapting electrical patterns in the brain. Every word sounded like nonsensical pseudoscience, but it didn't change the fact of what I'd experienced. And at the end of the day, that was the only thing that really mattered. I have to see it again, I said. I need to understand this. Funny you should say that, she smiled. I think we can work something out. Jane offered me a quid pro quo. She had a couple of patients who could benefit from a step-minding session, but she needed a neutral third party to act as the recipient. I seemed to be a good fit. I was skeptical, but she had a little bonus to sweeten the deal. She'd pay me a handsome sum of cash for each session as a kind of consultation fee. I was a bit hesitant, but I agreed. 1 week later, I sat in on a session with Jane and one of her patients. The patient had a dissociative issue and needed a step-minding session to alleviate a strange obsession she seemed to have with what sounded like a houseplant. I didn't pay too much attention. I was nervous. I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was the thought that what I'd experienced was real and how that would force me to change the way I viewed the world. If a thing like step-minding exists, who's to say there aren't ghosts or wizards? So I sat down with this stranger, and Jane started snapping her fingers. "Now look," she began, "look at yourself." Jane used the same words, the same sequence, the same rhythm, stepping out of my body and into another, but the difference was palpable this time. Lynn had been calm and collected, but this woman was the opposite. Sitting in her body, my pulse was higher, my legs were shaking, and my breathing was shallow. I was physically exhausted, but mentally wired. Thoughts rushing 100 different ways at once, and I didn't even know why. A single second in that body, looking across my table back at myself, and I could tell they were a troubled person. I was to sit there for a while, as Jane had a discussion with the other patient. Instinctively, I stood up to leave the room, to give them privacy, but I had to sit back down. My head started spinning as all these unfamiliar muscles reacted to my input, and I couldn't get very far. Perhaps the sitting down rule was there for a good reason. I Saturday there, trying to calm down, while the two of them had a discussion. I was asked to put on headphones for a bit, and I didn't mind. It was hard hearing anything through my pounding pulse anyway. As the session came to an end, Jane snapped her fingers, and I was back in my chair. My heart rate was slower. I wasn't shaking. I was nervous. But compared to the other patient, I was an obelisk of relaxation. For a moment, looking across the table, I could see her taking a deep breath. She was still shaking, but not as much as when we started. Perhaps that session gave her a new perspective on things. As the patient left, I got a moment to talk to Jane alone. I explained to her that if we had wheelchairs instead, the other patient could be rolled out during the session. That'd be more effective than using headphones. She really liked that idea, and suggested we'd try it at the next session, which inadvertently answered my next question. There was going to be more sessions. I worked on and off with Dr. Bogan for a couple of months. I usually did about 3 to 5 sessions per month, netting me a bonus income of about $400 per session. Jane ended up getting 2 wheelchairs and having her assistant, Jonathan, wheel me out while she had a conversation with the other patient. I grew accustomed to it and started to enjoy the sensation. It's sort of a pleasant ego death. You feel more connected to the world. It was becoming a steady source of secondary income, taking an afternoon off work to get paid for something that I, ultimately, enjoyed. Yeah, not a bad deal. Over the upcoming weeks, I got a couple more opportunities. I joined Jane on a couple of out-of-town sessions, meeting some clients she was following up on, mostly folks who need privacy for one reason or another, folks with all kinds of strange afflictions. I could probably write a book about those people alone. Coming back home, Jane contacted me about doing a couple of sessions where she wasn't personally involved. I was also asked to be the guide a couple of times, seeing as how I'd step-minded so many times and could recite the guiding words by heart. The pay was more than doubled, so I agreed. I had 3 guiding sessions on my own, one with a hippie couple who wanted to experience a sort of intimacy. Let's just leave it at that. Another session with 2 brothers, performing a trust exercise. The third one was a group of college kids who wanted to debunk the whole thing, and they left sort of befuddled. All in all, things were going well. Then I got a call about being a neutral third party. I was going to perform a switch with a patient, but this time Jane wasn't involved at all. The customer went straight to me. It was a group of people who contacted me. They described it as their dad having a disorder, and that they wanted to try step-minding to sort of reset him. They'd arranged their own guide, so they just needed me as a neutral third party, someone who wouldn't freak out about the process, as it might take a couple of hours to get through to him. It would be my longest session yet, but the pay was good, and I'd tried a lot of things up until that point. I was ready. I met the client, Harold, at his home in southern St. Cloud. Big place, 3 floors, gated property with both a pool and a tennis court. Modern architecture and heated floor tiles. The guide for the evening was a cheery woman in her 40s. She gave off a bit of a college professor kind of vibe. Apart from the client himself, there was a group of 4 other people who seemed to be close relatives. And of course there was Harold himself, the man I was supposed to work with. Harold was surprisingly upbeat. I couldn't see anything obviously wrong with him, which surprised me. From what I understood, he was in dire need of this treatment. He was a man in his early 60s, but could easily pass for 50. Hell, the man had better teeth than me. I could tell he must have been a salesman at some point. You can tell by the smile. I was introduced to the others, who introduced themselves as friends and family. We hurried into the living room, where a space had been prepared. We were all seated as a group. The guide had prepared everything and offered me a reassuring smile. She took our hands, something that Jane usually didn't do. "I just want to make sure we're all feeling good about this," she said. "We good?" "We good," I nodded. "We're good," Harold agreed. And with that, the session was on. The guide snapped her fingers, lowered her voice, and took us down the mental road and across the table. By then, I knew the process. The right words, with the right cadence, at the right time. I sunk back in my chair, looking at my feet, and felt the world shift. After a while, my shoes looked different. They were nicer, and my pants fit me better. Slowly, I started to feel the reality of my borrowed body, the various aches and pains, the thinning hair, the wrinkles on my cheek when I blinked. I'd aged about 30 years in a couple minutes, and it would take some time adjusting. Looking up and seeing myself in the opposite chair, I got this anxious sting in my chest. The thought crossed my mind, what if I never returned? The guide excused herself and left. She'd done her job, the rest was up to Harold and his associates. But as soon as I heard the front door close, the air in the room shifted. Harold was sitting there looking like me, stretching his arms. The others joined us, making a circle. One of Harold's associates, a young woman who'd introduced herself as Hope, spoke to the both of us. She could easily have been his daughter. "How you feeling?" she asked. "Everyone okay?" "Yeah," I nodded. "You do what you gotta do." "So this works?" Harold asked. This is it? It's done?" "It's done," Hope smiled. Harold pulled out a gun, a well-polished revolver. I was the only one who reacted, flinching at the sight of it. The others didn't seem to care. I didn't know what to do. Should I be scared? If so, why was no one reacting? "So we just cut the cord then," he said, "and we're good to go." "Wait, what are you—" They were tricking me. They put me in that old body and had no intention of putting me back. I held up my hand and snapped my finger 2 times, but before the third snap, I had a gun pushed against the back of my head. "That won't help," Hope said. "We'll just kill you when you're you again." It's hard to describe what I felt in that moment. The fear was real, but there was also a longing to go back. Being out of your own body is like sleeping outside. You feel exposed and maladjusted. If you know it's just for a while, it's not that bad. But if there's a chance you can't go back, it becomes terrifying, like getting lost in the woods. That's not even counting for the primal terror you feel from having a gun pointed at you. Harold seemed a bit confused, which made me realize that no one had explained the rules to him, that we couldn't get up, and that 3 snaps of a finger would cancel the effect. I got the impression that he thought this was, somehow, permanent. Looking at him, I could see a worry spread across his face, my face. "You said this was permanent," he said, looking at Hope. "It is, as long as you don't do 3 finger snaps. How's that gonna work when we cut him off?" "You're gonna have to make sure you're never around someone who snaps their fingers, Harold," she smiled. "That's not too much, is it?" "Do I have to remind you that I got the tapes to put you away?" Harold snarled back. "And that if anything were to happen to me, you're done." "Nothing's gonna happen, Harold," Hope chuckled. "Look, you're right there, safe and sound." She pointed at me. It was as if a light turned on in Harold's eyes. He was being double-crossed, just like me. In a desperate moment, he raised his handgun at me. I recoiled so hard that I fell out of my chair, feeling my heart skip a beat. Cold sweat spread across my arms, clinging to the thin inner fabric of Harold's expensive blazer. But there was no gunshot, just a click. His gun was empty. That click was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I came crumbling down to the floor, feeling the effects of the first rule, don't get up. I was immediately nauseous. I felt like a bobblehead as my head went one way and my body another. I collapsed in a pile, trying to find the magic number of blinks to make the world stop spinning. "You'll never get past the safety checks," Harold screamed. "You'll never get the backups. It's all fingerprinted," Hope sighed. "Fingerprinted, biocoded, voice-checked. Sorry." A man raised his arm. There was no second click. Instead, there was a bang. I looked up with my ears ringing, watching a reflection of my dead self on the other side of the coffee table. Bullet to the brain. Nothing but blank eyes looking back at me. My face didn't look dead, it just looked sort of tired, like I was sleepy. I was expecting that face to blink, but that blink never came. Blood pooled at the corner of the mouth, running down from the open wound at the temple. They pulled me up and dragged me over to Harold's workstation. They used my hand to log in. I had to do a voice recognition check as Hope's associates went through 2 laptops and a smartphone. While they did, Hope sat down across from me. My head was still swimming. "We're gonna need you," she said. "And as long as you play along, you will be fine. But if you fuck with me..." She snapped her fingers twice. Ice filled my veins as I gripped my seat. "I can't imagine something good would happen if we tried this," she said, lowering her voice. "So how about we just really pay attention?" She explained it to me. I was done for. Anyone in her crew could snap their fingers 3 times, and I'd be done. This also meant I couldn't perform step minding again, as you need a rhythmic finger snapping as part of the process. She explained the plan. They needed Harold alive to slowly transfer his company shares to someone else, without it looking all too suspicious. They needed access to his files, both immediate and over a longer time. They explained that they needed me around to make it appear that everything was fine. In return, I'd get to live in this amazing place, with whatever comforts I could ask for the rest of my days. But if I slipped up, snap, 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 done, fade to black. It was so surreal, watching them wrap up my own body in black plastic. Men in tailored blazers scrubbing the floors and walls with bleach. Hope sitting across from me, rubbing her fingers together. "Where do you think you'll go?" she asked. "If I snap my fingers, where do you think you'll go?" "I don't know," I stuttered. "I don't." "Maybe you'll be fine," she shrugged. "Maybe there's something nice and warm on the other side. Or maybe the snapping doesn't even work anymore. Wanna try?" "No." "No," she smiled. "No, you don't. You're smarter than that. And maybe you're not the gambling type." She tapped the barrel of the gun on Harold's mahogany desk. "You can have all the parties you want. You got a big bank account," she sighed. "But maybe be careful about inviting musical people, those who stomp their feet or snap their fingers." And that was that. I was left there. I had keys to a place I didn't know, a phone full of numbers I didn't recognize. I just stood there in the chlorine-smelling house of a stranger. I didn't know what to feel. Ever since I first started step-minding, I had never considered this. It was unreal. I remember looking down at my own hand, not being sure if I could snap myself out of it. What would happen? Over time, I got used to the nausea. Nowadays, it's gone. I can walk around like anyone else, but I have to avoid crowds. I can't risk hearing those 3 snaps. I watch videos with the sound off and subtitles on. I only watch movies after checking the soundtrack, making sure there's no snapping in the songs. Radio is out of the question. You never know where you might hear it. And even if you do, does it work hearing it through a TV or in a song? Would you risk it? I won't. I can't. I don't think I can ever adjust. I've thought about contacting people from my old life, but I wouldn't know where to begin. How do you explain this? I have to be careful not to draw any attention to myself, or Hope and her cronies might return, and if they do, well, I don't know how far I can push my luck. I mean, I'm comfortable. Harold made close to 6 figures a month on passive income. I've learned most things about his life. He never married. He has no children, and most of his contacts are passing acquaintances at best. He was a lonely man, and now, that's me. I've changed a couple of names in this story, as to not make it too obvious who I am. Then again, even if I said it outright, I can't imagine it would matter. No one's going to believe this. How do you convince someone that you're really someone else? It just sounds schizophrenic. I spend most of my days considering my options. I've thought about destroying my hearing as a safety measure. Yes, going deaf is awful, but you have no idea what it's like living with the thought that a sound that can be done at any time by anyone can kill you. It's exhausting, and you end up isolating yourself. So I'm typing this out on a fancy laptop, on a mahogany desk. I'm Harold now, screaming into the void that I used to be someone else. I'm sipping on a drink from a glass with my initials on it, and when I go to bed tonight, I will do the same thing I do every night. I will take a long look at myself. I got better vision now. Harold isn't short-sighted. But I can't look at myself. I'm not there anymore. It's just Harold. I've always loved nature. I grew up in a high-rise in the middle of a city, but I always tended to the window boxes and potted plants with care. I dreamt of becoming a farmer, although I'm sure the physical labor wouldn't have suited me at all, and, as a young woman, I jumped at the chance to work at a plant nursery in a small town in the suburbs. The village was tiny, only about 15 houses, but properly posh. Long driveways, red brick mansions, you name it. It was populated with pretty much only old people, the creepy kind who never leave their houses and don't like foreigners. As for the actual facility, it was pretty big for a garden centre. Big chain-link fences with 3 greenhouses full of tropical plants and countless rows of houseplants, flowers, and young tree saplings. There was also a reception near the entrance and an employees-only office full of filing cabinets, with a break room for us as well. Of course, as an employee of a plant nursery, I wasn't earning anywhere near enough to live in the area. In fact, my commute was about an hour and a half, so I worked overtime as many days as possible since I wanted to make the most of my time at work. It was one of those days on which my story happened. I was working the latest shift, taking care of some orchids. If you know anything about plants, you know how temperamental orchids are, and locking up. I was about halfway through turning the lights off when I heard a strange creaking noise from the darkness behind me. Not like a door opening, more like the sound it would make if you tried to bend a plank of wood. That's the only way I can describe it. It was quiet, almost fading into the background, and it stopped after a few seconds. I was a little freaked out, and I was a little more hasty in locking up. Just a couple of minutes later, though, I heard the sound again, this time from more than one place. It was also accompanied by a slithering sound, like you'd imagine the noise of a snake moving. Now I was seriously scared. I've never liked horror movies, and it's not as though I could fight against anything. The only thing I wanted was to get done with this place and go home. The feeling of relief which washed over me as I put the padlock on the main gate quickly tarnished as I felt for my phone in my pocket and failed to find it there. I had left it in the office like an idiot. My stomach sank. The prospect of walking through the darkness filled me with dread. Throughout the time I'd spent closing up, that sound had followed me, getting louder each time and giving me ample opportunity to invent various monsters it could be. My mind seemed hell-bent on preventing me from returning, but I had no choice. My train ticket home was on that phone. Pulling open the gate, I ran as fast as I safely could through the night, unidentifiable noises surrounding me. Suddenly, I tripped on something which should not have been there. Trying to orient myself, I felt around on the stone path. It felt different somehow, almost lumpy, as if something was pushing up on it from underneath. My searching hands touched something rough and cold, and I recoiled in surprise. When I cautiously felt for it again, I realized what it was: a tree root. There was a tree root growing on the path. In fact, now that my eyes were adjusting, I could see that there were many. Trees were growing all around me, where trees had not been before. Quite literally growing. I could see their branches getting longer, their trunks getting thicker, all the while making that quiet creaking noise. I don't remember feeling anything other than confusion at that moment. All I knew was that I needed to get my phone and get out. I rose slowly and began to walk towards the office, all the while staring in wonder at my surroundings. A few meters on, the thick walls of constantly growing trees subsided. Instead, the path was threaded with twining vines, large wildflowers pushing through cracks in the stone. I could see the colorful plants of the greenhouse bursting through the plastic roofing containing them. The office itself was encased in moss, and I had to force the door open, dislodging dirt and fungus from the hinges. The sight of my phone snapped me out of whatever trance I had been in for the past few minutes. Finally, comprehending what I was seeing, I forced myself to calm down. I was dreaming, I thought. All I needed to do was sleep, and I would wake up at home. I curled up on a chair, trying to ignore the crackling and groaning coming from outside. Maybe I was right. I did wake up in my bed that morning, but I never did find the plant nursery again. It turns out there never was one, or that is what my common sense is telling me. Just a forest where I thought it was. I suppose there was always just a forest. The only thing that makes me doubt that is where I found my phone. It was sitting on a rock in the middle of the woods, right where the garden center should have been. The woods were supposed to be a refuge. After everything that had happened, I just needed to get away. My life had been falling apart. Work stress, a messy breakup, and the overwhelming suffocation of city life. The decision to spend a weekend in a secluded cabin, far from everything, felt like the only way to breathe again. The first day had been exactly what I needed. I woke up to the sound of birds, the crisp air filling my lungs as I stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The trees stretched up to the sky, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. I spent the morning wandering the trails near the cabin, finding peace in the simplicity of nature, but that peace was short-lived. It started when I decided to go deeper into the woods. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had my phone with GPS, a map, and I was confident in my sense of direction. Besides, I'd always been good at hiking, and the thrill of exploring uncharted paths was too tempting to resist. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. The light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer, the air cooler. After a while, the trails became less distinct, overgrown with shrubs and brambles. I paused, realizing I hadn't seen a trail marker in some time. No big deal. I thought I'd just retrace my steps. But as I turned around, the woods felt different, more menacing. The path I'd come from seemed to vanish into the undergrowth. I tried not to panic. I took out my phone, only to find the GPS struggling to get a signal. The map app spun uselessly, and a cold trickle of fear ran down my spine. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I needed to head back to the cabin. I walked in what I thought was the right direction, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all started to blend together, their branches reaching out like twisted arms. I picked up my pace, my breath coming faster, trying to ignore the creeping dread clawing at the edges of my mind. Then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes behind me. I froze, straining to listen. It could have been anything, a deer or a squirrel, but the noise was too deliberate, too careful. It was as if something was watching me, following me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The rustling stopped. Silence fell over the woods, heavy and unnatural. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no reply. I took a step forward, and the rustling started again, closer this time. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I broke into a run, branches slapping against my face, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just needed to get away. But the rustling followed me, growing louder, more frantic. Whatever it was fast. I could feel its presence behind me, just out of sight. A low growl echoed through the trees, primal and hungry, and I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. Something was hunting me. My lungs burned as I ran, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't dare stop. The trees blurred past, and the last of the daylight faded into twilight. I was running blind, my mind a whirlwind of terror and exhaustion. Then, out of nowhere, I tripped. My foot caught on something, and I went sprawling, skidding across the dirt and leaves. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath. But I could hear it, whatever was chasing me. It was close, too close. I forced myself up, pain shooting through my ankle, and looked around frantically. The rustling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. My eyes darted through the darkened woods, searching for any sign of movement, but I saw nothing. The woods were deathly silent again. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, its head cocked to one side, as if studying me, and a wave of nausea hit me as I realized its eyes were glowing, a sickly, pale yellow. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The creature stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost like it was gliding. As it approached, I could see its features more clearly, or rather, the lack of them. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human's, with skin stretched too tight over its skull, and its mouth, if you could call it that, was a jagged line that split its face in two. I scrambled backward, trying to put distance between us, but the creature didn't rush. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear radiating from me. Then it spoke. Its voice was a distorted echo, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once, some too high-pitched, others too deep. Lost, alone, afraid. It whispered, each word crawling under my skin, twisting my insides with dread. Why do you trespass? My voice failed me. All I could do was shake my head, tears streaming down my face. The creature leaned closer, its breath a foul stench of decay, and for a moment I was certain this was it. I was going to die out here, devoured by whatever this thing was. But then something changed. The creature stiffened, its head snapping up as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Its glowing eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw something that looked like fear cross its twisted features. It turned its head, slowly scanning the woods around us, and I followed its gaze, though I didn't want to know what it was looking for. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that I could see my breath in the air. The trees around us creaked and groaned, their branches shaking as if buffeted by an invisible wind. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground, through my bones. It was deeper than anything I'd ever heard, more primal, more terrifying. The creature in front of me recoiled, taking a step back. Its glowing eyes darted around frantically, and for the first time, it looked unsure, even vulnerable. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. Whatever had scared this thing, this monster, was far worse than it could ever be. The growl echoed again, closer this time, and the creature hissed in response. It turned back to me, its voice more frantic now, the distortion in its tone more pronounced. "Run," it said, its voice overlapping itself in a chaotic cacophony. "Run, hide, now." Without waiting for me to respond, the creature backed away, its form dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. I was alone again, but that sense of relief was fleeting. The growl was still there, louder now, reverberating through the trees, and I could feel something moving through the woods, something massive. something that made the ground tremble with each step it took. I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and started to run. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was coming. The woods were a blur around me, darkness closing in from all sides, but I kept moving, driven by pure primal fear. The growl followed me, relentless, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was right behind me. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the cold seeping into my bones, and I knew that if I stopped, even for a second, whatever was chasing me would catch me, and there would be no escape. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning. My world reduced to the sound of my own heartbeat and the growl that stalked me through the woods. My legs were numb, my lungs burning, but I couldn't stop, I couldn't. And then suddenly the trees thinned, and I burst out of the woods into a clearing. The sight of open sky, the stars overhead, was like a shock to my system. I stumbled forward, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to comprehend that I was out, that I had somehow made it through. But the growl, it was gone. The air was still, the woods behind me silent. I turned, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees, some monstrous form to come crashing through, but there was nothing, just the wind whispering through the leaves. I didn't trust it. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to not look back, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I collapsed onto the grass, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I was safe, I tried to tell myself. Whatever it was gone. But even as I sat there, staring back into the dark maw of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting for the right moment. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, carried on the wind, my own voice, calling out from deep within the woods, pleading, desperate. "Please, help, I'm lost." My blood turned to ice. It was unmistakable. My own voice, distorted and echoing through the trees. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. But there it was, drifting through the night air like a mocking whisper. "Please, help, I'm lost." The words repeated, each one hitting me with a wave of dread. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing again, but I couldn't force myself to move. It was like my legs were rooted to the ground, my mind paralyzed by the terror of what I was hearing. My voice, but not my voice. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The woods were still, eerily quiet, but the voice kept coming, closer now, circling me, as if something was moving through the trees, just out of sight. "Please, I'm scared, help me." My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use the flashlight, to shine some light on the surrounding area, to see what was out there. But my phone, which had already failed me in the woods, flickered to life for only a moment before the screen went black, completely dead. I cursed under my breath, the last shred of control slipping away as the voice continued to circle me. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was familiar. It looked like me. No, not like me, it was me. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat as the figure mirrored my movements, stepping forward into the moonlight. I stared in disbelief as I saw my own face staring back at me, my own eyes wide with terror, my own mouth forming those same desperate pleas. "Please, help, I'm lost." The words were wrong, twisted, like a recording played on a loop, and I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that the figure wasn't quite right. Its movements were jerky, its features just slightly off, like someone trying to paint a picture from memory and getting the details wrong. The figure took another step closer, and as it did, its face began to change. The skin rippled, stretching, and the mouth split open into a grotesque grin that tore across its face. The eyes, which had once been a mirror of my own, glowed with a sickly yellow light. It wasn't me. It was the creature, the skinwalker, and it was using my voice, my face, to lure me in. I turned to run, but the moment I did, the air grew heavy again, that oppressive cold seeping back into the clearing. The growl returned, low and menacing, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The skinwalker frowned, its grin faltering as it whipped its head around, searching the darkness. The growl was closer now, much closer, and I could feel the ground trembling with the weight of whatever was approaching. The skinwalker hissed, its distorted voice breaking into a cacophony of overlapping sounds, a frantic chorus of voices pleading, crying, screaming. It started to back away, but it was too late. The woods exploded with movement as something massive barreled out of the trees, crashing into the clearing with a force that knocked me off my feet. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me, but I forced myself to look up. What I saw defied comprehension. It was a creature of darkness, a mass of shifting shadows and grotesque forms that writhed and twisted, never settling into a single shape. Eyes, douncins of eyes, glowed from within the mass, and a maw of jagged teeth opened wide, releasing that deep, primal growl that reverberated through the clearing. The skinwalker screamed, a sound that pierced the night, and it turned to flee, but the shadow beast was faster. It surged forward, tendrils of darkness shooting out, wrapping around the skinwalker, dragging it back into the depths of the woods. The last thing I saw of the creature that had been hunting me was its face, my face, twisted in a final, desperate scream before it was consumed by the darkness. And then, just like that, the clearing was silent. I lay there, too stunned to move, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The air was still, the oppressive cold lifting, but the fear didn't leave me. I knew I wasn't safe. Not yet. Whatever that thing was, it had taken the skinwalker, but it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. I forced myself to stand, my entire body trembling. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, had to find my way back to civilization, to safety. But the woods were vast, and I had no idea which way to go. I glanced back at the spot where the skinwalker had been taken, the ground disturbed, the grass flattened, but there was no sign of the creature or its predator. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. Not a growl this time, but a whisper, low and insidious, slithering into my mind. Run. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. Without another thought, I turned and ran, sprinting across the clearing and into the woods. The trees closed in around me, the darkness thickening. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't know what was behind me, but I knew I had to keep moving, had to get away. The whisper followed me, echoing through the trees, urging me on, and I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. I lay there, gasping for breath, waiting for the growl, for the whispers, for the darkness to claim me. But nothing came. The woods were silent again, the oppressive presence gone, and for the first time, I felt like I might actually survive this. I forced myself up, my body screaming in protest, and continued forward, walking through the night, praying that I would find the cabin, or at least the road, anything that would take me away from this nightmare. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, but it was enough to renew my strength, to push me forward. I stumbled through the trees, my vision blurring with exhaustion and fear, until I broke through the undergrowth and found myself standing on a dirt road. The light was coming from a small cabin, not mine, but it didn't matter. I staggered toward it, every step an effort, and pounded on the door. A few agonizing moments passed before it opened, and a man stood there, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Help me." He didn't hesitate. He pulled me inside, shut the door, and the warmth of the cabin washed over me, a stark contrast to the cold that had gripped the woods. I collapsed onto the floor, my body giving out, and darkness took me. When I woke, I was safe. The man had called for help, and I was taken to the hospital, treated for exhaustion and dehydration. They found my cabin, but they never found the creature or its predator. I didn't tell them what I had seen. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. But I knew the truth, knew that the woods were haunted by more than just ancient trees and wildlife. There was something out there, something beyond human comprehension, and it was hunting the hunters. I left the city after that, moved far away, somewhere the woods were nothing more than a distant memory. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to the sound of a low growl, or a whisper that slips through my mind like a cold breeze, and I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting, and one day it might come for me again. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.